The ancient stones of the palace walls have stood guard over centuries of royal secrets, witnessing countless sunrises and weathering innumerable storms. Yet on this particular morning, a different kind of tremor ran through their time-worn foundations. It wasn't the rumble of thunder or the clash of distant armies, but a far more subtle, yet infinitely more potent disturbance that began not with a bang, but with a hushed ripple spreading from the private chambers of Prince William. For years, he had moved with the practiced grace of a future king, a silhouette of duty and decorum against the backdrop of tradition, always mindful of the delicate balance the monarchy maintained between the weight of its history and the demands of the present. This equilibrium, however, had always felt precariously poised, especially when it came to the radiant, yet tragically brief life of his mother, Princess Diana. Her memory, a potent force that refused to fade, had been treated with a careful, almost hesitant reverence within the palace walls, a legacy managed rather than fully embraced. But on this day, Prince William felt the familiar ache of remembrance coalesce into a resolute purpose. He had spent his adult life observing, absorbing, and deeply feeling the impact his mother's unconventional spirit had on the world, and he had come to a profound understanding that Diana was not merely a chapter to be respectfully closed, but a living narrative whose influence was vital to the monarchy's very soul. As he prepared for a momentous announcement, the air inside the palace seemed to thicken, charged with an unseen energy, as if the very ghosts of royal history were holding their breath, sensing that a long-dormant legacy was about to be awakened with an intensity that could no longer be contained or carefully managed. This wasn't just a matter of personal sentiment. It was a strategic decision, a powerful statement of intent that would send a shockwave through the very core of the establishment, challenging decades of carefully constructed protocols and stirring emotions that had been deliberately, or perhaps inadvertently, buried deep beneath the surface of royal duty. The world outside, with its bustling cities and its constant hum of daily life, remained oblivious, but within the gilded cage of Buckingham Palace, the seeds of a profound transformation had just been sown, and the consequences for Queen Camilla, King Charles, and the very future of the crown were about to unfold in ways none could have fully predicted. As William stepped into the private meeting room, the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the busy world and leaving only the sound of 3 hearts beating in a room filled with gold furniture and the weight of many centuries of history. King Charles looked up from his large oak desk, his eyes searching his son's face for any sign of what was coming, while Queen Camilla sat in a soft chair nearby, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were turning white as if she could already sense the power of the papers William held in his hands. When William began to speak, his voice did not shake at all, but instead, it was filled with a quiet and steady strength that seemed to fill every corner of the large room, making it very clear to his father and the Queen that he was no longer just a son asking for permission, but a future leader making a firm choice that he believed in with all his soul. He slowly laid out the details of his massive tribute to his mother, describing how her name, her special way of helping the poor, and her unfinished work would be brought back to the very front of everything the royal family did from this day forward. As he spoke, the color slowly drained from Queen Camilla's face, and she looked as though the air had been knocked out of her, because she understood immediately that this was not just a small memorial, but a complete change in how the monarchy would be seen by the entire world. It was as if a heavy curtain had been pulled back on a stage that had been dark and quiet for many years, and the bright, warm light of Princess Diana's memory was suddenly shining so brightly that it made everyone else in the room feel like they were standing in a cold shadow. King Charles felt a strange and confusing mixture of pride for his son's bravery and a deep, sinking worry about what this would do to the peace and stability he had tried so hard to build since the day he became king. He watched his wife's reaction very closely, seeing the way her eyes darted toward the window as if she wanted to escape the heavy feeling that was filling the air. A feeling that told her the past was no longer buried in the ground, but was standing right there in the room, demanding to be acknowledged. The room grew colder even though the bright morning sun was shining through the glass, and for several long minutes, no one said a single word as the true meaning of William's words began to sink into their minds like a heavy stone falling into a very deep and dark well. This was the exact moment when everything they thought they knew about their family's future changed, and the careful silence that had been kept for more than 20 years was finally broken by a son who refused to let his mother's voice be silenced by the passing of time any longer. When the meeting finally ended, Queen Camilla did not wait for the servants to open the doors for her, but instead, she stood up quickly and hurried out of the room as if she were trying to run away from a fire that was starting to burn everything she had worked for. Her face was very pale, and her breath was coming in short, quick gasps as she walked down the long, gold-lined hallways of Buckingham Palace, her high heels clicking loudly against the cold marble floors like a clock ticking down to something scary. Those who were standing in the hallways, from the royal guards in their red uniforms to the young women carrying silver trays of tea, all stopped what they were doing and watched her with wide, curious eyes, because they had never seen the queen look so completely shaken to her core before. Usually she was very calm and had a polite smile for everyone, but today her expression was unreadable and full of a deep, raw emotion that made it clear she was suffering from a huge internal shock that she couldn't hide from the people around her. As she reached her private chambers and shut the heavy doors behind her, she finally let out a long breath and sank into a chair, feeling the weight of history crashing down on her shoulders like a mountain of lead. She looked around her beautiful room, filled with expensive things and symbols of her power, but all she could think about was the long, dark shadow of Princess Diana that had suddenly come rushing back into the palace halls as if she had never left at all. The truth was out now, and Camilla knew that no matter how hard she tried to be the perfect queen, the world would always look at her and see the woman who stood in the way of a princess that everyone loved like a member of their own family. It was an overwhelming force of sadness and fear that took over her heart, and she felt more alone in that giant palace than she had ever felt in her entire life, knowing that her own stepson had just started a fire that she might never be able to put out. While the queen was hiding away in her private rooms, the rest of the palace began to change in a way that was very strange and very quiet, as the usual hum of daily life came to a sudden and complete halt. The air in the hallways became thick with tension, and it felt so heavy that it was hard for the staff to breathe as they moved cautiously through the building, whispering to each other behind closed doors and exchanging uneasy glances that said more than any words ever could. Even the clocks seemed to tick more slowly as the news of Prince William's bold move began to trickle down from the high halls of power to the people who worked in the kitchens and the offices. Everyone was processing what had just unfolded, and they knew that the monarchy they had served for so long was standing at a crossroads that would change everything about their future. The silence was not peaceful, but instead, it was a heavy, scary silence filled with unspoken words and questions that no one was ready to answer yet, like what King Charles would do next, and if the family would ever be able to be happy together again. Staff members who had worked there for 30 years whispered that the palace felt just like it did on the dark day many years ago when Diana first left, and that same feeling of a huge, world-changing event was hanging in the air once more. They watched the closed door of the Queen's room and the closed door of the King's study, knowing that inside those rooms, the past and the present were fighting a battle that would decide the fate of the crown for 100 years to come. Inside that very study, King Charles sat perfectly still in his high-backed chair, his hands resting on the cold, dark wood of his desk as he stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace that hissed and popped in the quiet room. A deep and heavy sadness filled his heart, a feeling he had not felt so strongly in many years, as if the very walls of his study were slowly closing in on him and demanding that he make a choice he was not ready to make. For decades, he had worked so hard to build a life of peace and to show the world that the monarchy could be stable and strong. But in just one morning, his eldest son had brought back all the memories and all the pain that Charles had tried to tuck away in the back of his mind. He looked at the portraits of kings who had ruled before him, men who had to choose between their families and their duty, and he realized that he was now standing in their shoes, facing a problem that had no easy answer. On one side of the palace, his wife Camilla was hurting, her heart broken by the sudden return of a woman she could never hope to beat in a popularity contest. And as her husband, Charles wanted nothing more than to protect her and tell her that everything would be okay. But on the other side stood William, the future king and a man who had his mother's eyes and her stubborn courage, and Charles knew that his son was not just being difficult, but was doing what he felt was right for the soul of the country. The king stood up and walked slowly to the large window that looked out over the green gardens, watching the tiny birds fly from tree to tree, totally unaware of the giant storm that was happening inside the palace walls. He thought about Diana, remembering her laugh and the way she used to light up a room just by walking into it, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt that he had tried to move on so completely that he had left no room for her memory to breathe. He knew that William's bold move was a way of telling him that the past cannot be erased, and that Diana's love for the people was a power that was much stronger than any rule or any crown. Charles felt caught in an impossible predicament, a trap where every move he made would hurt someone he loved, and the pressure of the crown on his head felt heavier than it ever had before. He wondered if he could find a way to support his son's dream of honoring Diana without making Camilla feel like she was being pushed out into the cold. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that some things cannot be balanced. The air in the study felt thick with the smell of old books and wood smoke, but it also felt thick with the spirit of a woman who had been gone for a long time but had never really left the hearts of her children. Charles knew that the world was watching and waiting for him to say something, but for the first time in his life, he didn't know the right words to say to keep his family together while also doing his duty as a king. He sat back down and put his head in his hands, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, knowing that every second that passed was bringing him closer to a moment where he would have to pick a side in a battle that had been brewing for over 20 years. While the king was lost in his sad thoughts in the quiet study, a very different kind of energy was exploding in the secret offices hidden deep within the back parts of the palace where the most powerful advisors lived. These men and women, often called the men in gray suits, were the ones who kept the wheels of the monarchy turning, and right now, those wheels were spinning so fast they were starting to smoke from the heat of a looming disaster. They hurried through hidden doors and narrow stone hallways that tourists never get to see, their faces tight with a fear that they tried very hard to hide behind their expensive glasses and fancy folders. They gathered in a large room with a long table made of dark wood, and the sound of their voices was a low, frantic hum that sounded like a nest of angry hornets, because they knew that Prince William's announcement was like a giant ticking clock that was about to go off in front of the whole world. Their job was to protect the secrets of the palace and make sure the royal family always looked perfect. But William had thrown a giant rock into their calm pond, and now they were drowning in the ripples of a story they couldn't control. They were terrified that the big newspapers and the television news stations would find out exactly how upset Queen Camilla was and how much tension was pulling the family apart. So they began to speak in hurried whispers about how to spin the story to make it look like everyone was happy and united. Phones were ringing off the hooks, and the blue light from computer screens lit up their worried faces as they tried to find a way to stop the truth from leaking out of the palace walls like water through a cracked dam. The head advisor, a man who had worked for the royals for 40 years and thought he had seen everything, stood at the head of the table and slammed his hand down to get everyone's attention, his voice shaking just a little bit as he told them that this was not just a small problem they could fix with a polite letter. He explained that William had moved too fast and too boldly, and that the great beast of the public press was already sniffing around the gates, sensing that something huge was happening behind the gold-tipped fences. The advisors began to argue with each other, some saying they should try to talk William out of his plan, and others saying it was too late, and they had to find a way to make Camilla look like she was part of the tribute so the world wouldn't see the jealousy and the pain. They knew that if the public saw the queen retreated in her room and the king unable to decide what to do, it would look like the monarchy was falling into a big hole of chaos, and that was the one thing they were paid to prevent at all costs. The air in the room was hot and smelled like coffee and nervous sweat, and every time a door opened, everyone jumped as if they expected the ghost of Diana herself to walk in and demand to know why they were still trying to hide her from the people. They felt like they were in a race against a giant storm that was moving much faster than they could run, and as they scribbled notes and made frantic phone calls to the editors of the big news shows, they realized that the old ways of keeping secrets were dying right in front of their eyes. This was a new world where a prince could speak his heart and the whole planet would hear him in an instant, and the advisors felt small and powerless against the strength of a son's love for his mother, a love that was currently tearing their carefully built plans into tiny little pieces. High above the frantic noise of the advisors and the heavy silence of the king's study, Prince William stood alone on a cold stone balcony, his hands gripping the iron railing as he looked out over the vast city of London that stretched as far as his eyes could see. The wind was biting and cold, pulling at his dark coat and tossing his hair, but he didn't seem to feel the chill because his mind was miles away, wandering through memories of a time when the palace felt full of laughter and light instead of secrets and shadows. Below him, far beyond the tall gold-tipped gates of the palace, He could see the tiny figures of hundreds of people gathered on the sidewalk, their cameras flashing like little stars, and their voices rising up in a faint hum that sounded like the distant roar of the ocean. He knew that those people were there for his mother, just like they had been there for her every single day of her life, and he felt a giant lump form in his throat as he realized that he was now the only one who could truly give them back the woman they had lost. Even though he knew his decision had sent the entire palace into a state of panic and had caused his father and Camilla deep distress, a sense of calm strength filled his heart because he finally felt like he was being honest with the world and with himself. He remembered the way his mother's hand felt when she held his, the way her perfume smelled like fresh flowers, and the way she always told him to never let the coldness of the palace change the warmth of his heart. And in this moment, he felt her standing right there beside him on that lonely balcony. As the sun began to hide behind thick gray clouds, William knew that his moment of peace was about to end, and that he would have to go back inside to face the storm he had created. He could almost feel the weight of the crown sitting on his head, even though he wasn't wearing it yet, and he understood that being a king was not about wearing fancy clothes or living in a big house, but about having the courage to do what is right even when everyone else is telling you to stay quiet. He looked down at the people one last time, seeing a woman in the crowd holding a picture of Princess Diana with the words, "The People's Queen," written in big letters, and he knew right then that he would never regret what he had done. He turned away from the wind and stepped back through the glass doors, the warmth of the palace hitting his face, but the coldness of the family's tension hitting his soul even harder. He knew he had to walk back down those long, echoing hallways and look his father in the eye once more. And he knew that the conversation they were about to have would either bring them together or push them apart forever. With a deep breath that filled his lungs with the scent of old wood and history, William straightened his shoulders and began the long walk back toward the king's study, ready to fight for his mother's memory, no matter how many people tried to stand in his way or tell him that the past was better left forgotten. The walk back to the king's study felt like the longest journey Prince William had ever taken, even though it was only a few hundred steps through the quiet, carpeted hallways that he had known since he was a small boy. As he moved past the tall, golden-framed portraits of his ancestors, it felt as though their painted eyes were following him, judging him for breaking the silence that had kept the palace together for so long. He could hear the faint sound of his own breathing and the steady beat of his heart, which felt like a drum reminding him that he could not turn back now, no matter how much he wanted to avoid the pain that was waiting behind the next door. When he finally reached the heavy oak doors of his father's study, he didn't knock right away, but instead, he stood there for a second, feeling the cold brass of the handle against his palm and thinking about how his mother used to joke that the palace was more like a beautiful prison than a home. He pushed the door open slowly, and the smell of old paper and wood smoke hit him immediately, along with the heavy, sad feeling of a father who was disappointed in his son. King Charles was still sitting at his desk, but he looked much older and more tired than he had just an hour ago, his face lined with the stress of trying to keep a crumbling peace between the people he loved most in the world. As William walked toward the center of the room, he saw that his father's hands were shaking just a little bit as he held a fountain pen, and for a moment, the prince felt a sharp sting of guilt for causing so much trouble for a man who was already carrying the weight of a whole kingdom on his shoulders. But then William looked at a small, silver-framed photo on a side table, a photo of his mother laughing in a field of sunflowers, and his resolve became as hard as a diamond once again, because he knew that being a good son to his father did not mean he had to be a bad son to his mother. While the king and the prince were trapped in their heated argument inside the quiet, smoky study, the walls of the palace could no longer hold the secret that was bursting to get out. It happened in an instant, starting with a single ping on a cell phone that led to 1,000 more, until the entire internet was buzzing with the news that something massive was happening behind the royal gates. A junior assistant in the media office, someone who was too young to remember the old days but too excited to keep quiet, had whispered a few words to a friend, and like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water, the truth began to spread and stain everything it touched. Within minutes, the big news stations in London, New York, and Paris stopped their regular programs to show a breaking news banner that read, "William's secret tribute to Diana revealed." And just like that, the quiet tension of the palace became a global explosion of emotion. The advisors and the men in gray suits, Office watched in horror as their computer screens filled up with thousands of messages from people all over the planet, some crying with joy and others demanding to know why the palace had kept this a secret for so long. They realized that their race against time was over and they had lost, because the great beast of the public press was no longer just sniffing at the gates. It was roaring with a hunger that could not be satisfied with polite letters or excuses. The secret was no longer a family matter discussed in hushed tones over tea, but a headline that was being read by millions of people sitting on buses, working in offices, and waking up in their beds far across the ocean. Outside the tall, gold-tipped gates of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere changed from a quiet morning to a scene of incredible chaos and passion in what felt like the blink of an eye. People began to arrive by the hundreds, then by the thousands, coming from every corner of the city as if they were being pulled by a giant magnet toward the place where Diana once lived. They brought with them bundles of bright yellow flowers, handwritten signs that said, "We love you, Diana," and old photographs of the princess that they had kept tucked away in their homes for 27 years. The sound of the crowd grew into a massive, low rumble that could be heard deep inside the palace, a sound that was full of love, but also full of a demand for the truth that made the windows rattle in their frames. The royal guards, standing tall in their heavy black hats, had to call for more help as the wall of people pressed against the iron bars, their faces lit up by the glow of their cell phones as they shared the news with the rest of the world. It was as if the spirit of the 1990s had suddenly come back to life, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sound of people singing songs that reminded them of the woman they called the Queen of Hearts. Inside the study, the sound of the crowd reached the ears of King Charles and Prince William, cutting through their argument like a sharp knife and forcing them to look toward the window in stunned silence. William felt a surge of incredible power and relief, knowing that the people were standing with him and that his mother's army of fans was now his army too, while Charles felt a cold shiver of fear down his spine because he remembered this sound all too well from the dark days of his past. The king realized that he could no longer control the story or protect Camilla from the world's judgment, because the world had already decided that they wanted Diana back, and they were not going to go home until they got what they wanted. The ringing of the telephones in the hallway became a constant, shrill noise that wouldn't stop, and the advisors began to pound on the study door. Their voices panicked as they shouted that the situation had moved beyond anything they could handle. The palace was no longer a fortress where they could hide their problems, but a glass house sitting in the middle of a global storm, and every person in that crowd was a witness to the moment the monarchy was forced to face its ghost. William looked at his father, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and victory, and told him that the people had spoken, and now there was only one thing left to do. They had to open the doors and let the memory of Diana finally come home. The silence in the room was so thick you could almost taste it, like the dust in a room that hasn't been opened in years. Until finally, King Charles looked up and spoke in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, asking William if he truly understood what he was doing to the family. He spoke about Camilla, telling William that she was in her room crying because she felt like she would never be enough, and that the world would always see her as the villain in a story that had no happy ending. He told William that the monarchy was like a fragile glass vase that could shatter if it was bumped too hard, and that bringing back the drama of the past was like hitting that vase with a hammer. William listened quietly, but he didn't look away, and when he finally spoke, his voice was like a calm river flowing over jagged rocks, telling his father that the vase was already broken and that they were just pretending it was whole. He told Charles that the people didn't want a family that was perfect and cold, but they wanted a family that was real and brave, a family that wasn't afraid to say the name of the woman who had given them so much love. He argued that by hiding Diana away like a secret to be ashamed of, they were losing the very thing that made the people care about the crown in the first place. The argument between the two men grew more intense, their voices rising as they talked about duty, love, and the way the world was changing faster than the palace could keep up with. It wasn't just a fight about a tribute or a speech. It was a battle for the soul of the monarchy itself, with a father trying to protect the present and a son trying to reclaim the past to build a better future. As the shadows in the room grew longer, and the fire in the hearth began to die down into glowing red embers, the divide between the king and the prince felt like a giant canyon that was getting wider with every word they spoke, leaving both of them wondering if their relationship would ever be the same again after this day of truth. While the roar of the crowd grew louder outside the heavy stone walls, Queen Camilla stood perfectly still behind the thick velvet curtains of her private bedroom, her fingers trembling as she pulled the fabric back just an inch to peek at the world below. From her high window, the scene looked like a sea of color and movement, a giant wave of people that seemed to go on forever down the long road leading away from the palace. She could see the bright yellow of the sunflowers and the pure white of the lilies being piled against the iron gates, and even from that distance, the large posters with Diana's smiling face looked as though they were staring right back up at her. A cold, heavy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach, a feeling that told her no matter how many years she spent trying to be a good queen or how many charities she supported, she would always be a stranger in a house that still belonged to someone else. The sound of the people singing and shouting Diana's name drifted up through the glass, and it felt like a sharp reminder that some loves are so strong that even death cannot make them fade away. Camilla remembered all the quiet years she had spent building a new life with Charles, thinking they had finally found peace and that the world had moved on. But now she realized that the peace was only a thin layer of ice over a very deep and very cold ocean of memory. She turned away from the window, unable to watch the sea of flowers any longer, and looked around her beautiful room, which suddenly felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The expensive paintings on the walls and the soft, silk-covered furniture didn't make her feel like a queen in that moment. They made her feel like someone who was just holding a spot for a person who was never coming back but would never truly leave. She thought about William and the look of determination she had seen in his eyes earlier that morning, and she finally understood that he wasn't just trying to be a difficult stepson, but he was acting out of a deep, painful love that she could never hope to touch or change. A single tear tracked down her cheek as she realized that her life in the palace had changed forever in the span of just a few hours, and that the quiet acceptance she had worked so hard to get from the public was vanishing like mist in the morning sun. She knew that from this day forward, every time she walked out onto a balcony or visited a hospital, the ghost of the woman in the photographs outside would be there, standing between her and the people. The weight of the crown she wore felt like it was made of lead, and for the first time, she truly feared what the future would hold for her, and Charles as they tried to navigate a world that was suddenly falling back in love with a princess from the past. She sat down at her vanity mirror, looking at her own reflection, and saw a woman who was tired of fighting a battle that she now knew she could never win, while outside, the chants of the crowd continued to shake the very glass in her windows, demanding a legacy that she could never provide. The heavy door of the king's study creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire palace, signaling the end of the long and painful battle of words between a father and his son. King Charles stepped out into the hallway, his shoulders slumped as if the very air was pressing down on him, and he didn't even look at the advisors who were waiting nearby with their frantic questions and their ringing phones. He walked past them like a man in a dream, his feet moving slowly over the thick red carpets that had muffled the footsteps of royalty for generations. But today they could not muffle the loud, roaring sound of the crowd outside that was still calling for Diana. Every step he took toward Camilla's private rooms felt like he was walking through deep mud, and he had to stop for a moment to lean against a cold marble statue, closing his eyes as he tried to find the strength to face the woman he loved. He knew that the news he was carrying would break her heart even more, because he had realized during his talk with William that there was no way to stop the giant wave of history that was now rushing through the palace gates. When he finally reached Camilla's door, he paused for a long second, listening to the muffled silence on the other side, before he slowly turned the golden handle and stepped into the room where the light was dim and the air felt cold with sadness. He found Camilla sitting on the edge of her bed, her back to him as she looked toward the window where the sky was turning a dark, stormy gray, and the sight of her sitting there so small and so quiet made a sharp pain shoot through his chest. He walked over to her and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the way she shivered under his touch. And for a long time, neither of them said a word as the distant chants from the street drifted up through the glass like a ghost's whisper. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were red from crying, and her voice was a thin, broken sound as she asked him if it was true if the world was really going to turn back into the place it was 30 years ago, when she was the most hated woman in the country. Charles sat down beside her and took her shaking hands in his heart breaking because he knew he couldn't give her the comfort she wanted, as he had to admit that William's move had worked, and that the people were now demanding a legacy that he couldn't hide any longer. He told her about the sea of flowers at the gate, and the way the world's cameras were all pointed at their home, and he had to tell her that they could no longer fight against the memory of Diana because she was simply too powerful to be ignored. Camilla looked at him with a mixture of fear and a strange kind of understanding, realizing that her husband, the King of England, was just as powerless as she was against the love the people felt for the princess who was gone. They sat there together in the growing shadows, two people who had spent their whole lives trying to find a bit of happiness, only to find that the past was a monster that would never stop chasing them until it was finally faced. The king leaned his head against hers, and for a moment they weren't a king and a queen, but just an old man and an old woman who were terrified of a ghost they could never hope to beat in a battle for the people's hearts. The room felt like it was shrinking around them, and the golden luxury of the palace seemed to turn into a cold, dark prison as they realized that from this day forward, their lives would never be the same and the quiet peace they had worked so hard for was gone forever. Outside, a sudden crack of thunder rolled across the sky, sounding like a giant drum, and as the first drops of rain began to hit the window, Charles and Camilla held on to each other as if they were drowning, knowing that the real storm was only just beginning and that William was the one holding the lightning in his hands. While the rain began to soak the thousands of flowers piled against the palace gates in London, thousands of miles away in a place where the sun was shining bright and the air smelled of salt and sea, Prince Harry sat on his quiet porch and looked at his phone with wide, stunned eyes. The golden light of California was a sharp contrast to the gray shadows of his old home, but as the headlines flashed across his screen, he felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the weather. He read the words over and over again, his heart racing in his chest like a trapped bird, as he realized that his brother William had finally done the thing they had both dreamed about in secret for so many years. He looked out at the tall palm trees and the blue sky, but in his mind, he was back in the cold, dark hallways of the palace, walking behind his mother's coffin while the whole world watched him cry. A strange and powerful mixture of pride and sadness washed over him because he knew exactly how much courage it took for William to stand up to the king and the advisors to protect their mother's name. For a long time, Harry had felt like he was the only one fighting to keep Diana's memory alive from across the ocean. But now, he saw that his brother was doing it from the very heart of the monarchy itself. The distance between them had felt like a giant canyon for a long time, but in this moment, the memory of their mother acted like a bridge, pulling Harry's thoughts back to the life he had left behind, and the brother he still loved despite all their arguments. He stood up and began to pace back and forth on the wooden deck, his mind spinning with questions and a deep, nagging feeling that he couldn't just stay silent while history was being rewritten in London. He thought about his mother's smile and the way she used to hold him close, and he felt a tear prick at his eye as he realized that the world was finally waking up to the truth he had known his whole life. But then, he remembered the pain of the palace, the way the men in gray suits had treated him, and the coldness that had pushed him away from his family in the first place. He was torn between his new life of freedom and his old life of duty, wondering if he should pick up the phone and call William, or if he should just stay quiet and let the storm pass. His wife and children were inside the house, representing the peace he had fought so hard to find, but outside, the ghost of his mother was calling to him from the headlines and the news reports that were currently taking over the world. He knew that if he went back to London now, he would be walking back into the fire he had escaped, but he also knew that he couldn't let William stand alone in this fight for their mother's honor. The phone in his hand began to buzz and ring constantly as messages from friends and news reporters flooded in, asking him what he thought about the William Revolution happening at the palace. Harry looked at a photo of him and William as boys, both of them wearing their school uniforms and laughing together, and he felt a sharp pang of loneliness for the brotherly bond they used to have before the world pulled them apart. He realized that this moment was a turning point for him too, a chance to finally heal the wounds of the past, or a risk of making everything much worse. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, and Harry knew that he had a very big decision to make before the day was over. He looked toward the horizon, in the direction of the ocean that separated him from his home, and wondered if he was brave enough to cross that water and face the king, the queen, and the ghost of his mother one more time. The air was still and quiet around him, but inside his head, the roar of the crowd in London was getting louder and louder, demanding that he take his place beside his brother in the most important battle of their lives. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the purple mountains of California, leaving the sky in a deep shade of orange that looked like a fading fire. when Prince Harry finally stopped his pacing and looked down at the phone that felt like a heavy piece of lead in his hand. He knew that the distance between him and his brother was not just thousands of miles of cold ocean water, but also years of angry words, hurt feelings, and a silence that had grown so thick it felt like a wall that could never be broken. But as he looked at the news reports showing the sea of flowers for his mother in London, he realized that if there was ever a time to tear that wall down, it was right now, in the middle of this giant storm that was shaking the very foundations of their family. With a hand that trembled just a little bit, Harry scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he hadn't called in a very long time, and with a deep breath that felt like he was jumping off a high cliff, he pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. The ringing sound seemed to go on forever, echoing in the quiet air of his porch, and for a moment, Harry thought about hanging up and running back into his house to hide from the past. But then the ringing stopped, and he heard a voice that made his heart skip a beat. It was the voice of his brother William, sounding tired and worn out but also filled with a strange kind of calm. And for several long seconds, neither of them said anything at all, as if they were both shocked that the connection was actually happening. Finally, Harry broke the silence with a voice that was thick with emotion, telling William that he had seen everything, and that he was so proud of the bravery his brother had shown in standing up for their mother's name. He spoke about the flowers, the crowds, and the way the world was finally talking about Diana again, and he could hear the sound of William's breath hitch on the other end of the line as the weight of those words hit him. William told him that the palace was in a state of complete chaos, that the king was upset, and the queen was hiding in her room, but he also said that for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly doing the right thing for their mother's memory. They talked in low, hurried whispers, two brothers who had been pulled apart by the world, but were now being brought back together by the ghost of the woman they both missed every single day of their lives. William admitted that he felt very alone in the giant palace, and that he wished Harry was there to stand beside him against the men in gray suits, who were trying to make him stop, and that was the moment when Harry knew what he had to do. He told William that he wouldn't let him fight this battle by himself, and that he was going to find a way to get back to London as fast as he could, even if it meant facing the anger of his father and the judgment of the entire world. The conversation lasted for over an hour, with the two brothers sharing memories of their mother that they hadn't talked about since they were children, and the bridge that had been broken for so long began to mend right there in the dark of the night. They laughed about the way Diana used to sneak them out for burgers, and how she would always make them promise to look after each other, and the pain of the last few years seemed to melt away just a little bit under the heat of their shared purpose. Harry felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years, knowing that he and William were finally on the same side again, working together to make sure their mother's light would never be dimmed by the shadows of the palace. When they finally hung up, Harry stood in the darkness for a long time, looking at the stars and feeling like his mother was watching him from somewhere far away with a smile on her face. He knew that his decision to go back would set off a whole new kind of explosion, and that the men in gray suits would do everything they could to stop him, but he didn't care anymore because he was no longer just a duke in exile. He was a son on a mission. He walked back into his house and began to pack a small bag, his mind already flying across the ocean toward the gray skies of London and the brother who was waiting for him in the middle of the most important royal revolution in 100 years. Inside his quiet home in California, Prince Harry moved through the shadows of his living room with the speed of someone who knew that every second counted if he wanted to reach his brother before the palace gates were locked tight against him. He sat down at a small desk, the only light coming from the glowing screen of his laptop, which cast long, flickering shadows against the walls as he began the difficult task of trying to book a secret flight across the world. He knew that if he used his real name or called the usual people who helped him travel, the news would reach the palace in a heartbeat, and the men in gray suits would do everything in their power to block his path or stop the planes from flying. With a heart that was thumping like a drum in his chest, he reached out to a private pilot he trusted, someone who didn't care about royal rules and only cared about the mission, and they began to whisper in hurried tones about secret airfields and flight paths that would keep him hidden from the prying eyes of the world's media. Harry felt like a spy in his own life, a man on the run who was trying to break back into the family he had fought so hard to leave, all because the love for his mother was a magnetic force that was pulling him across the ocean. He packed a small bag with just a few clothes and a single faded photograph of him, William, and Diana sitting on a sun-drenched lawn, knowing that this piece of paper was the only passport he truly needed for the journey ahead. As he quietly closed his front door and stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement, knowing that once he boarded that plane, there would be no turning point and no way to hide from the massive explosion of history that was waiting for him in London. However, deep inside the high-tech security offices of the palace, where the lights never go out and the walls are covered in glowing television screens, the eyes in the dark were already starting to notice something strange. These were the professional monitors and intelligence officers whose only job was to track every move of the royal family, and they had special software that flagged any unusual activity or secret travel plans involving the king's sons. One of the monitors, a man who had spent years watching the digital footprints of the royals, saw a tiny blip on his screen. A private jet was being fueled at a small airport near Harry's home, and the destination was a quiet airfield just outside of London. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses as he realized that the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence, and he immediately picked up a red telephone to call the head of royal security, his voice low and urgent as he delivered the news that the Duke of Sussex was on the move. Within minutes, the quiet offices of the palace advisors were buzzing with a new and even more terrifying kind of energy, as the men in gray suits realized that their worst nightmare was coming true. The two brothers were about to reunite in the middle of the biggest crisis the monarchy had faced in decades. They knew that if William and Harry stood together on that balcony, backed by the memory of their mother and the roar of the crowd, the old guard of the palace would lose all their power to control the story. Frantic messages were sent to the king's study and the queen's private rooms, warning them that the storm was about to get much bigger and that the second son was flying through the clouds at that very moment, bringing with him a whole new level of drama that could either save the family or tear it into pieces forever. The red telephone on King Charles's desk began to ring with a sharp, insistent sound that seemed to cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the study like a jagged knife. Charles, who had been staring blankly at the dying embers in the fireplace, jumped at the noise, his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached out a trembling hand to answer the call that he knew, deep in his gut, would change everything once again. On the other end of the line, the head of royal security spoke in a voice that was clipped and cold, informing the king that a private jet had just taken off from California and was currently cutting through the dark clouds over the Atlantic Ocean, headed straight for a small, private airfield just outside the city of London. The official explained that they knew exactly who was on that plane, and that the men in gray suits were already suggesting that the flight be diverted, or that the prince be told he was not welcome to land during such a time of high tension and public unrest. Charles listened in a stunned silence, the weight of the crown feeling like a crushing physical force upon his brow, as he realized that his youngest son was not just watching from afar, but was charging back into the fray to stand beside his brother in a show of unity that the palace had not seen in years. Just as the king was about to speak, the door to the study opened slowly, and Queen Camilla stepped inside, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from the hours she had spent crying in her private rooms. She didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. She could see the look of pure, agonizing conflict on her husband's face, and she knew that the nightmare she had been living was about to double in size. She walked over to the desk, her voice a mere whisper as she asked if it was true that Harry was coming back, and when Charles nodded his head, she sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer hold the weight of her body. The advisors were now buzzing at the door, peering through the crack with their worried faces, whispering that they could easily invent a technical problem at the airport to force Harry's plane to turn around or land in a different country. Anything to keep the two brothers from standing together in front of the hungry cameras and the emotional crowds. Camilla looked at Charles, her eyes pleading for him to protect the fragile peace they had built. But the king looked past her, toward the window where the rain was still lashing against the glass, and the distant roar of the people was still calling out for the memory of the woman who had once been his wife. In that moment, a strange and powerful change came over King Charles, a realization that he could no longer lead his family or his country through lies, secrets, and closed doors. He thought about his two sons, the boys who had walked behind a coffin together all those years ago, and he realized that by trying to keep them apart and trying to hide the memory of their mother, he was only making the fire burn hotter and brighter. He stood up straight, his voice suddenly loud and clear as he spoke into the red telephone, commanding the security team and the advisors to step aside and let the plane land without any trouble or delay. He told them that Harry was his son and a prince of the blood, and that no matter what had happened in the past, He would not be the king who slammed the door in his own child's face when the memory of their mother was at stake. The advisors looked at each other in total shock, their faces turning pale as they realized that the king was finally taking control and that their power to manage the family's emotions was slipping through their fingers like sand. Camilla let out a soft, broken sob and covered her face with her hands, knowing that the arrival of Harry meant the final end of the quiet life she had hoped for, while Charles stood by the window, watching the lightning flash in the distance and waiting for the sound of the engines that would bring his family back together for a reckoning that was 27 years in the making. The private jet descended through the thick, ink-black clouds over the English countryside, its wings shaking violently as it fought against the howling winds and the lashing rain of the most powerful thunderstorm the region had seen in years. Inside the cabin, Prince Harry gripped the armrests of his seat so hard that his knuckles turned white, his heart pounding in rhythm with the engine's roar as he looked out the window at the tiny, flickering lights of the runway below. When the wheels finally touched the wet tarmac with a loud splash and a jolt that vibrated through his entire body, he let out a long, shaky breath, realizing that he was finally back on the soil he had left under such different circumstances. The plane slowed to a crawl as it moved toward a dark, quiet corner of the airfield, far away from the main terminals and the prying eyes of the public, where a single black car stood waiting with its headlights cutting through the sheets of rain like two bright, searching eyes. As the heavy cabin door creaked open and the cold, damp air of England rushed in to meet him, Harry felt a sudden wave of memory hit him so hard it almost knocked him back, the smell of the wet grass and the old earth reminding him instantly of the summers he spent running through the palace gardens with his mother and brother. He stepped down the metal stairs, his boots splashing into deep puddles, and he ducked his head against the wind as he ran toward the waiting vehicle, wondering what kind of welcome he would receive now that he had officially crossed the line back into his father's kingdom. Just as he reached the car, the door swung open, and a tall man in a dark coat stepped out, holding a large umbrella to shield Harry from the downpour that was turning the world into a blurry, watery mess. Harry expected to see a cold-faced security guard or one of his father's stern advisors, but as the light from the car's interior hit the man's face, he realized it was a longtime friend of William's, someone who had been with the brothers since they were teenagers. The man didn't say a word at first, but he reached out and placed a firm, steady hand on Harry's shoulder, a silent gesture of support that told the prince he was among friends and not enemies in this dangerous game. He leaned in close to Harry's ear so he could be heard over the thunder, and told him that William had sent him personally to ensure that the men in gray suits did not intercept the prince before he could reach the palace. The man handed Harry a small, handwritten note that was tucked inside a waterproof plastic sleeve, and as Harry climbed into the back seat, he quickly tore it open to find just a few words written in his brother's familiar, messy handwriting. "I knew you would come. Meet me at the back gate and we will finish this together." Harry felt a surge of adrenaline and heat rush through his veins, replacing the cold chill of the rain, because he knew that the two of them were finally united in a secret mission that was bigger than any royal protocol or family argument. As the car sped away from the airfield and began the long, dark journey toward the heart of London, Harry watched the raindrops race down the window, feeling like a soldier returning to a battlefield he thought he had left forever. He could see the distant glow of the city lights reflecting off the low clouds, and he knew that somewhere in that brightness, thousands of people were still gathered at the palace gates, waiting for a sign that the legacy of their beloved princess was finally being honored. The car moved through the empty country roads with a quiet, powerful hum, and Harry felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that no matter what happened when they reached the palace, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought about the king and queen sitting in their silent rooms, and he thought about William waiting in the shadows of the garden, and he realized that the two brothers were about to do something that would change the face of the British monarchy for the next 100 years. The storm outside continued to rage, with lightning flashing across the sky and lighting up the dark fields in bursts of electric blue. But inside the car, Harry sat in a focused, determined silence, ready to face the ghosts of his past and the challenges of his future for the sake of the mother who had never truly left his side. The black car moved through the dark and rainy streets of London like a ghost, avoiding the main roads where the news trucks and the loud crowds were gathered, and instead winding through narrow, cobblestone alleys that had stayed the same for hundreds of years. Prince Harry leaned forward in his seat, his eyes searching the darkness as the car slowed down near a tall, ivy-covered brick wall that most people didn't even know was part of the royal grounds. This was the secret back gate, a place used only for emergencies and private departures, and as the car came to a stop, the headlights flickered off, leaving Harry in a world of deep shadows and the constant, heavy drumming of the rain on the roof. Two royal guards, wearing dark waterproof capes and holding heavy weapons, stepped out from a small stone guardhouse, their faces hidden behind the brims of their hats as they approached the car with a cold and serious look. Harry felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird, wondering if the men in gray suits had changed the orders at the last second to keep him out, or if these guards would only see him as the prince who had walked away rather than the son who was coming home to help. The driver rolled down the window just an inch, the cold wind whistling into the car, and for a long, heart-stopping minute, no one said a word while the guards shined a bright, blinding flashlight into the back seat to see who was hiding in the dark. Harry squinted against the light, his breath hitching in his throat as he waited for the guards to either open the gate or tell the driver to turn around and leave the country forever. He saw the guards look at each other, their eyes reflecting the tension of the night, and he realized that they were just as caught in the middle of this royal storm as he was. Just as one of the guards reached for his radio to call for instructions, a tall figure emerged from the shadows of the garden on the other side of the heavy iron bars, walking slowly through the rain without an umbrella or a coat. It was Prince William, his shirt soaked through and his face pale in the moonlight, but his eyes were burning with a fierce and protective light that Harry hadn't seen in many, many years. William walked right up to the gate and placed his hand on the cold metal, his voice ringing out loud and clear over the sound of the thunder as he commanded the guards to open the gate immediately and let his brother through. The guards jumped at the sound of the future king's voice, their stiff postures breaking as they quickly punched in the secret codes and pulled the heavy bars open with a loud, metallic groan that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. As the car pulled through the gate and came to a stop on the gravel path, Harry didn't even wait for the driver to open the door, but instead he jumped out into the pouring rain and stood face to face with the brother he had been fighting with for so long. For a few seconds, neither of them moved or spoke, the only sound being the splashing of the rain and the distant, muffled roar of the crowd far away at the front of the palace. Then, without a single word of anger or apology, William stepped forward and pulled Harry into a tight, powerful hug, and the two brothers stood there in the dark garden, holding onto each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. The years of silence, the mean headlines, and the hurt feelings seemed to wash away in the cold English rain, replaced by the unbreakable bond of two boys who had lost their mother and were now finally ready to honor her together. William pulled back and looked at Harry, a small, sad smile touching his lips as he whispered that he knew Harry wouldn't let him do this alone, and Harry felt a surge of strength and pride that made him stand a little taller. They knew that inside the palace, the king, the queen, and the advisors were waiting with 1,000 questions, but out here in the shadows, they were just two brothers on a mission to save the memory of the woman they loved most. Together, side by side, they began the walk toward the back entrance of the palace, ready to face the world and change the monarchy forever, knowing that as long as they stood together, no one could ever dim the light of Princess Diana again. The two brothers stepped through the heavy glass doors of the back entrance, leaving the cold, lashing rain behind and entering the warm, silent world of the palace. Their boots were soaked and muddy, leaving dark footprints on the beautiful white marble floors that usually looked as clean as a fresh sheet of paper. As they walked side by side, water dripped from their hair and coats, making a soft tapping sound on the floor that seemed to echo through the long, empty hallway like a warning. They didn't look like the perfect, polished princes the world usually saw on television. They looked like two men who had just come back from a long war, their faces tired, but their eyes filled with a fire that showed they were not going to be stopped by anyone. The palace air felt different now. It was dry and smelled of old wood, expensive flowers, and the wax used to polish the silver. But it also felt heavy with a kind of fear that made the very walls seem to shrink as the brothers moved deeper into the heart of the building. They knew that every step they took brought them closer to the people who had tried to keep them apart and the people who wanted to keep the memory of their mother hidden in the dark. As they reached the grand staircase that led toward the king's private rooms, a group of 5 men appeared from a side hallway, blocking their path like a wall made of expensive fabric and cold expressions. These were the men in gray suits, the high-level advisors who spent their whole lives making sure nothing ever changed in the palace, and that the royal family always followed the oldest, strictest rules. The head advisor, a man with white hair and a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling, stepped forward and held up his hand, telling the brothers that they could not go any further and that Prince Harry was not authorized to be inside the palace at this hour. He spoke about protocol and the schedule, using big words to try and make the brothers feel like they were just children who didn't understand how things worked. The other advisors stood behind him, clutching their leather folders and looking at the floor, too afraid to look the future king in the eye but too stubborn to move out of the way. It was a standoff between the old world of secrets and the new world of truth, and for a moment, the only sound in the hallway was the ticking of a giant gold clock that had been keeping time since the days of Queen Victoria. William didn't wait for the advisor to finish speaking, but instead, he took a half step forward, his shadow falling over the smaller man and making him flinch back just a little bit. In a voice that was low and dangerous, a voice that sounded exactly like a king in command, William told the men that the time for rules and schedules was over and that they were currently standing in the way of a family that was finally healing itself. He told them that he was the Prince of Wales and that Harry was his brother, and if they didn't step aside immediately, they would find themselves without a job before the sun came up the next morning. The advisors looked at each other, their faces turning a pale shade of gray that matched their suits, as they realized that the power they had held for so many years was vanishing right in front of them. They had always counted on the brothers being angry at each other, but seeing them standing together, wet and determined, was a sight that terrified them more than anything else. Slowly, with their heads bowed in a sign of defeat, the men in gray suits stepped back against the walls, creating a path for the brothers to walk through. William and Harry didn't even look at them as they marched past, their hearts beating in sync as they headed toward the giant wooden doors of the king's study, ready to face their father and finish the work that their mother had started all those years ago. The massive, gold-handled doors of the king's private study did not just open. They seemed to groan under the pressure as Prince William and Prince Harry pushed them wide, bursting into the room like a sudden gust of wind that threatened to blow out every candle and knock over every piece of expensive history. Inside, the air was still and smelled of old, dusty books, expensive cigars, and the sweet, heavy scent of the lilies that Queen Camilla kept in a silver vase near the window. But that stillness was shattered the moment the two brothers stepped onto the thick Persian rug. King Charles was standing by his desk, his hand frozen in the act of pouring a glass of water, while Camilla sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet sofa, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief as she looked at the two men standing before her. William and Harry were a sight that no one in that room would ever forget, their hair matted to their foreheads with rain, their expensive coats dripping puddles onto the ancient wood floor, and their faces etched with a fierce, unbreakable determination that made them look more like soldiers than princes. For several long, agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic dripping of water and the distant, muffled roar of the crowd outside, which sounded like a giant beast waiting to be fed. Charles felt a sharp, electric jolt go through his heart as he looked at his two sons standing side by side for the first time in years, and in the dim light of the study, they looked so much like their mother that it felt as though Princess Diana herself had walked into the room to demand an explanation for all the years of silence. The silence in the room was so heavy and thick that it felt like they were all standing at the bottom of a deep, dark ocean, where every word spoken would have the weight of a mountain. King Charles slowly put down his glass, his fingers trembling just enough for the ice to clink against the side, and he looked from William to Harry with a face that was a mask of exhaustion and hidden pride. He saw the way Harry's jaw was set tight, a look he inherited from the Spencer side of the family, and he saw the way William stood just a little bit in front, protecting his younger brother just as he had promised to do when they were children. Camilla, on the other hand, felt a cold wave of isolation wash over her, realizing that she was the only one in the room who did not share the blood or the memories that were currently humming in the air like a live wire. She saw the photograph of Diana on the side table, the one William had focused on earlier, and it felt as though the smiling woman in the picture was laughing at her, knowing that the Queen of Hearts would always have a power that no title or crown could ever touch. The brothers didn't say a word at first. They simply stood there, a united front of reign and resolve, and their presence alone was a more powerful statement than any speech the men in gray suits could ever write. William took a single step forward, his boots making a wet, squelching sound on the rug, and he looked his father straight in the eye with a gaze that did not blink or waver even for a second. He told his father, in a voice that was low and vibrated with emotion, that the game of pretending was over and that they were not there to ask for permission anymore, but to tell him how things were going to be from now on. He gestured to Harry, and for the first time in a decade, the two brothers shared a look of complete and total understanding that didn't need any words to explain the bond they had rebuilt in the rain. Harry spoke then, his voice a bit raspy from the long flight and the cold air, telling his father that he had come halfway around the world not to start a fight, but to make sure that the woman who gave them life was finally treated with the respect she deserved in the house where she had suffered so much. The tension in the room was so high that it felt like the very walls might crack, and the king realized that he was no longer looking at his little boys, but at two powerful men who were ready to tear down the old walls of the monarchy to build something that was finally honest and real. Charles looked at Camilla, who was clutching a silk pillow as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea, and then he looked back at his sons, seeing the legacy of Diana shining in their eyes like a beacon in the night. He knew that the advisors were still huddled outside the door, waiting for him to kick Harry out or to tell William to be quiet, but he also knew that if he did that, he would lose his children forever and the monarchy would die with them. The king let out a long, shaky sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his regrets, and he slowly walked around his desk to stand in front of his sons, his face softening into the look of a father instead of a monarch. He realized that this was the moment he had been running away from for 27 years, the moment where he had to face the truth of what his family had become and what they had lost in the pursuit of duty and shadows. As the lightning flashed outside, illuminating the four of them in a brief, brilliant white light, the room felt like the center of the entire world, and the conversation that was about to happen would determine if the House of Windsor would heal its broken heart, or if it would finally shatter into pieces under the weight of a mother's enduring love. The air in the study was so thick with emotion, and the scent of damp wool that it felt like the four of them were breathing in the very history they were trying to rewrite. King Charles, with a slow and heavy movement, gestured toward the circle of green velvet chairs near the fireplace, his voice barely a whisper as he asked his sons to sit down and talk like men instead of soldiers. William and Harry sat side by side, their wet coats making dark spots on the expensive fabric, but they didn't seem to notice the cold or the discomfort because their minds were focused on the huge task ahead of them. Camilla sat across from them, her eyes darting between the two brothers as if she were looking for a way to understand the power they now held together. For a few minutes, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the rain tapping against the glass, until William reached into his pocket and pulled out a damp, folded piece of paper that contained the plan he and Harry had been working on in secret. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers steady, and began to explain that they were not there to just ask for a statue or a simple ceremony, but they were demanding a complete change in how the royal family lived and worked. He told his father that from this day forward, the Diana way, the way of being kind, being real, and being close to the people, had to become the official rule of the palace instead of an old secret they were afraid to talk about. William explained that he wanted to create a new, permanent branch of the monarchy that would be entirely dedicated to the causes Diana loved, like helping people with mental health, protecting children in war zones, and feeding the hungry, and he wanted this work to be just as important as the king's own duties. He looked at his father and said that for too long, the palace had been a place of cold stone and strict rules that made the people feel like their royals didn't understand their pain. But he wanted to tear those invisible walls down just like his mother had started to do. Harry leaned forward then, his voice filled with a passion that had been building up for years, adding that they wanted to open up the palace more to the public and share the truth about their lives so that the world could see they were a real family with real feelings. He told Charles that the people out there in the rain were not just fans of a celebrity, but they were people who felt a deep connection to Diana because she made them feel seen, and the monarchy would only survive if it started making people feel that way again. They spoke about a people's protocol, where the royals would spend less time in fancy uniforms and more time on the streets, listening to the stories of regular people, and using the power of the crown to solve real problems instead of just following old traditions. As the brothers spoke, Camilla felt a cold shiver go down her spine because she realized that in this new world they were building, there was very little room for the old ways she had spent her life trying to master. She asked, her voice trembling just a little bit, what would happen to the traditions and the roles that had been in place for hundreds of years, and if this new plan meant that she would always be seen as the person who didn't belong. William looked at her, not with anger, but with a serious and honest expression, and told her that everyone would have to change, including her, if they wanted the family to stay together. He explained that if she wanted to be a queen that the people respected, she would have to embrace the memory of Diana instead of trying to hide from it, and she would have to show the world that she was brave enough to stand in the light of the past. It was a terrifying thought for her, but as she looked at the two brothers sitting there with so much strength and unity, she realized that the old guard of the palace was gone, and a new era was being born right there in that smoky study. Charles sat back in his chair, his eyes closed as he listened to his son's vision, and he felt a strange sense of relief washing over him, as if a heavy weight he had been carrying for 27 years was finally being lifted off his chest. He realized that William and Harry were giving him a way to finally be a father and a king at the same time, and that by embracing Diana's legacy, he could finally heal the wounds that had been hurting his family since the 1990s. He looked at the paper William held, seeing the messy notes and the bold ideas, and he knew that the men in gray suits would hate every single word of it, but he also knew that the people outside would love it with all their hearts. Just as he was about to speak, a sudden roar of cheers erupted from the crowd at the front gates, so loud that it could be heard clearly through the walls, and the king realized that the world was already sensing the change that was happening inside. William then delivered the final, most shocking part of the plan. He and Harry wanted to go out onto the balcony together, right now in the rain, to tell the people that the brothers were back, and that their mother's heart was finally beating inside the palace again. This was the moment of truth for King Charles, the moment where he had to decide if he was brave enough to let his sons lead the monarchy into a future that belonged to Diana's spirit. King Charles sat in the deep silence of his study, the only sound being the crackle of the fire and the distant, muffled roar of the thousands of people outside who were waiting for a sign from a family they had both loved and struggled with for so long. He looked at the faces of his two sons, William and Harry, and for a moment, he didn't see the grown men who were standing there with wet hair and muddy boots, but he saw the two little boys who used to hide under his desk and play with his pens. He saw the pain they had carried in their hearts since that dark tunnel in Paris many years ago, and he realized that all the rules in all the big books of the palace were not worth as much as the love he saw shining between the two brothers right now. The advisors were still pounding on the door, their voices sounding like tiny, angry insects as they shouted about schedules and security. But the king slowly reached out and pressed a button on his desk that locked the door tight, cutting off the noise of the men in gray suits for the first time in his life. He looked at the paper William had given him, the one that talked about bringing Diana's heart back into the center of the monarchy, and he felt a warm tear track down his cheek, because he finally understood that he couldn't be a great king until he was a brave father. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking just a little bit, and he walked over to his sons, placing one hand on William's shoulder and the other on Harry's, and told them in a voice that was thick with emotion that he was proud of them, and that he would stand by their side as they changed the world together. Camilla watched this from her chair, her heart racing as she saw the power of the family bond fixing itself right in front of her eyes, and she knew that there was no going back to the old, quiet ways of the past. She saw the king look at her with a soft, pleading expression, and she realized that she had a choice to make. She could stay in the shadows and be afraid, or she could stand up and be part of this new, honest future that the brothers were building with their bare hands. With a deep, shaky breath, she stood up and walked over to the three men, placing her hand on Charles's arm and nodding her head to William and Harry, a silent signal that she was ready to step into the light with them, even if it was scary. The tension that had been like a heavy chain around the room for hours finally snapped, replaced by a feeling of incredible relief and hope that made the air feel light and fresh again. William and Harry shared a quick, powerful look of victory, knowing that they had done the impossible. They had convinced the King of England to follow his heart instead of his advisors. They quickly took off their wet, heavy coats, tossing them onto the sofa, and straightened their shirts, looking like two modern heroes who were about to step onto the biggest stage in the history of the world. The walk from the king's study to the grand balcony was a journey that felt like it took a lifetime, even though it only lasted a few minutes as they moved through the long, quiet hallways of the palace. The men in gray suits stood frozen against the walls, their faces pale and their eyes wide with shock as they saw the king, the queen, and the two princes walking side by side toward the giant glass doors that led to the front of the building. There were no cameras here, no news reporters, just the family walking through the shadows of their ancestors. their footsteps echoing against the marble floors like the sound of a new era being born. William led the way, his head held high and his shoulders broad, while Harry walked right beside him, his face set in a look of fierce determination that showed he was never going to let go of his brother's hand again. They could feel the vibration of the crowd's noise through the very floor beneath their feet, a deep, rumbling sound that was full of love, hunger, and a demand for the truth. As they reached the final set of velvet curtains that hid the balcony from the world, the king stopped and looked at his sons one last time, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and love, and he whispered that they should go first because this was their moment and their mother's victory. William reached out and gripped the golden handle of the balcony door, his fingers steady even though the world was about to explode into noise the second he opened it. And he looked at Harry with a smile that was full of the old brotherly love they had lost for a while. He could feel the spirit of his mother standing right there in the hallway with them, her perfume smelling like fresh lilies and her laughter echoing in his mind, telling him to be brave and to show the people that the heart of the monarchy was finally beating again. Outside, the rain was still falling, but the sky was starting to crack open with a little bit of light, and the thousands of people were huddled together under umbrellas, waiting for anything that would tell them their princess was not forgotten. William took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of history, and with one strong pull, he swung the heavy doors open, letting the roar of the world rush into the palace like a giant, beautiful wave of sound. He stepped out onto the cold stone balcony first, followed closely by Harry, and the second the people saw the two brothers standing together in the rain, the entire city of London seemed to erupt in a scream of joy that was so loud it could be heard for miles. This was the moment the world had been waiting for since 1997, the moment when the sons of Diana finally came home to lead the people into a future that was built on love instead of secrets. The moment Prince William and Prince Harry stepped out onto the cold, wet stone of the balcony. It felt as though the entire planet had suddenly held its breath for one heart-stopping second, before exploding into a sound so loud and powerful that it shook the very foundations of the palace. Below them, a sea of thousands of people stretched as far as the eye could see, a swirling ocean of colorful umbrellas, glowing cell phone lights, and waving flags that all seemed to surge forward toward the iron gates like a giant, living wave. The rain was still lashing down from the dark sky, soaking the brothers' hair and shirts in an instant, but neither of them flinched or moved to go back inside, because the energy coming from the crowd was like a warm, electric current that made them feel stronger than they had ever felt in their entire lives. For 27 long years, the world had waited to see the two sons of Diana standing together like this, not in sadness or behind a coffin, but in strength and unity, and the sound of the people screaming their names and the name of their mother was so intense that it made the air itself vibrate. William looked out at the flashing cameras and the crying faces in the crowd, and he felt a giant lump form in his throat as he realized that by simply standing next to his brother, he had given the people the one thing they had been hungry for since the day they lost their princess. He reached out and gripped the cold railing of the balcony, his knuckles white, while Harry stood right beside him, his eyes shining with a mixture of raw pain and incredible pride as he looked down at the posters of his mother's face that were being held high by the cheering fans. The flashes from the thousands of cameras below were so bright and constant that it looked like a storm of lightning was happening on the ground, illuminating the brothers in a brilliant white light that made them look like figures from a legend. Far away in newsrooms in every corner of the world, journalists were scrambling to find the right words to describe what they were seeing. And on social media, the images of the two brothers on the balcony were being shared millions of times every minute, setting the internet on fire with a hope that had been missing for a long time. Inside the palace, behind the thick glass of the doors, King Charles and Queen Camilla watched the scene with stunned expressions, realizing that the men in gray suits had been completely wrong about the power of the people and the strength of the brothers' bond. The crowd began to chant, "Diana, Diana, Diana," in a rhythmic, deep boom that sounded like the heartbeat of the entire city, and the sound was so full of love and long-buried emotion that even the most cynical people in the palace felt a shiver of awe go down their spines. William turned his head just a little bit to look at Harry, and he saw a single tear track down his brother's cheek, catching the light of the flashes, and in that moment, he knew that they had finally done it. They had brought their mother home to the people who never stopped loving her. This was not just a simple appearance for the news. It was a revolution of the heart that was happening in real time, a moment where the old, cold traditions of the royal family were being washed away by the rain and replaced by a new kind of leadership that wasn't afraid to be human. The brothers didn't wave with the stiff, formal hand gestures that they had been taught since they were children, but instead, they stood there with their shoulders touching, looking out at the world with honest, open faces that said they were ready to lead with kindness and truth. They could feel the weight of the past lifting off the palace, and the dark shadows that had haunted their family for so long seemed to vanish in the brilliant light of the crowd's devotion. As the wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of the thousands of lilies piled at the gates, William and Harry realized that they were no longer just the sons of a king, but they were the guardians of a legacy that belonged to everyone. The roar of the world continued to grow, a beautiful and terrifying sound that signaled the end of the old monarchy and the birth of something brand new. And the two brothers stood tall in the center of the storm, ready to face whatever came next as long as they had each other and the memory of their mother to guide them through the dark. The air on the balcony was electric, crackling with a strange and beautiful energy that made the skin on Prince William's arms prickle despite the freezing rain that was now drenching him to the bone. As the sound of the chanting crowd below reached a deafening peak, vibrating in his chest like a deep, ancient drum, William felt a sudden and powerful urge to do something more than just stand there as a figure for the cameras. He turned his head slowly to look at his brother Harry, whose face was wet with a mixture of raindrops and tears that shimmered like diamonds under the constant, blinding explosions of the camera flashes. In that silent, heavy moment, a whole lifetime of shared secrets, childhood games, and the deep, stinging pain of their shared loss passed between them in a single look that didn't need any words at all to explain. William reached out his hand, his fingers steady and strong, and he gripped Harry's forearm in a firm, brotherly hold that was exactly like the way they used to brace each other when they were small boys facing a scary world. Harry didn't hesitate for even a second before he reached out, and did the same, their arms locking together in a powerful symbol of unity that told the whole world that the wall between them had finally crumbled into dust. When the thousands of people in the crowd saw this simple, silent gesture of love and brotherhood, the sound they made was no longer just a cheer, but a roar of pure, unfiltered joy that seemed to shake the very clouds in the sky. It was as if the collective heart of the city had been waiting decades for this one moment of healing, and the sight of the two brothers holding on to each other in the rain was the spark that set the entire world on fire with hope. People in the front rows began to sob openly, leaning against the iron bars of the palace gates for support, while others hoisted their children high onto their shoulders so they could witness the historic moment when the sons of Diana finally chose each other over the cold rules of the crown. The brothers then turned together, still holding each other's gaze for a heartbeat, and they both looked up at the dark, stormy sky as if they were searching for a glimpse of the woman who had brought them to this point. At that exact moment, as if the universe itself was responding to their vow, a sudden and brilliant crack of lightning split the clouds directly above the palace, illuminating the entire scene in a flash of bright white light that made the brothers look like legends carved out of the storm. Inside the palace, King Charles felt his knees go weak as he watched the two men through the glass, realizing that this silent gesture had done more to save the monarchy than 1,000 speeches ever could. He saw the way the people were looking at his sons, not with the distant respect they usually showed to the royals, but with a deep, passionate love that was a mirror of the love they had once felt for Diana. Queen Camilla stood beside him, her hand pressed against the glass as she watched the sea of people below reacting to the brothers' unity, and she felt a sense of awe that pushed away her fear, realizing that she was witnessing a miracle of the human spirit. The advisors in the hallways were frozen in place, their phones and folders forgotten, as they realized that the power had completely shifted from their offices to that cold stone balcony where two brothers were rewriting the rules of the kingdom with a single touch. The crowd below began to sing an old song that was a favorite of the princess, the melody rising up through the rain like a warm blanket of sound that wrapped around William and Harry, making them feel like they were no longer alone in their grief. As the rain continued to pour down, turning the streets into shimmering rivers of gold under the streetlights, William and Harry stood their ground, refusing to go back inside even as their clothes became heavy and cold. They wanted the people to see that they were not afraid of the storm, and that they were willing to stand in the rain for as long as it took to show that the heart of the palace was finally open again. Every flash of a camera and every shout from the crowd felt like a brick being added to a new foundation for the monarchy, one that was built on honesty, emotion, and the unbreakable bond of family. They knew that when they finally stepped back inside those glass doors, the world would be a different place than it was when they walked out, and they were ready for the challenge. The silent vow they had made to each other on that balcony was a promise to never let the shadows of the palace pull them apart again, and to always lead with the same courage and kindness that their mother had shown to the world. The roar of the people eventually settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse of support that felt like a shield around the brothers. And as they stood there in the center of the world's attention, they finally felt the peace that had been missing from their lives for 27 long years. When Prince William and Prince Harry finally turned away from the roaring sea of people and stepped back through the giant glass doors, the sudden silence of the palace hallway felt like a thick, warm blanket being wrapped around their shivering shoulders. Their clothes were heavy and dripping with the cold English rain, making loud splashing sounds on the marble floor. But as the heavy doors clicked shut and blocked out the deafening noise of the crowd, the two brothers felt a peace that was much deeper than any silence. They stood there in the dim light of the hallway for a moment, their breath coming in short gasps and their eyes still bright with the electric energy of the balcony, looking at each other with a sense of relief that made their hearts feel lighter than they had been in years. The long, dark shadows of the palace, which had always felt so scary and full of secrets, now seemed to be filled with a soft, golden light that made everything look different and new. They knew that the entire world was currently exploding with news reports and television specials about their historic reunion. But in this quiet hallway, they were no longer global icons or heirs to a throne. They were simply two sons who had finally finished the hardest part of a journey they started when they were just little boys. King Charles was waiting for them just a few feet away, standing near a tall suit of armor that had stood in that spot for 100 years. And as he watched his sons approach, he didn't look like a powerful monarch or a stern leader at all. He looked like a father who had been through a long and terrifying storm and was finally seeing his children return home safe and sound, his face softened by a kind of love and pride that he had struggled to show for a very long time. He walked toward them slowly, his own eyes wet with tears that he didn't try to hide anymore, and he reached out to pull both of his sons into a giant, clumsy hug that smelled of old wool and wood smoke. For several long minutes, the three of them stood there in a tight circle, the king's hands resting on the backs of his sons' wet heads, and the weight of the crown seemed to vanish as the weight of their shared history finally felt manageable. Charles whispered to them that he was sorry for all the years of silence, and that he finally understood that the memory of their mother was not something to be feared, but a light that they all needed to follow if they wanted to be a real family again. Queen Camilla stood a little further back in the shadows, watching this scene with a quiet and thoughtful expression that showed she had finally accepted the change that had swept through the palace like a tidal wave. She saw that the brothers were not trying to take anything away from her, but they were simply making room for the truth, and she realized that her own life would be much easier now that she didn't have to compete with a ghost in the dark. She stepped forward and gave the brothers a small, respectful nod, a silent promise that she would no longer stand in the way of their mother's legacy, and the tension that had been between them for decades seemed to evaporate into the warm air of the hallway. The men in gray suits and the busy advisors were nowhere to be seen, having retreated into their offices to deal with the chaos of the news, leaving the family alone in a rare moment of pure, honest connection that felt like a miracle. Outside, the rain continued to fall and the people continued to cheer. But inside the palace, the long war of the heart was finally over, and a new era of honesty and love was beginning to take root in the very floors and walls of the royal home. As the king and his sons began to walk slowly back toward the private living quarters, talking quietly about the future and the things they would do to help the people, the palace felt like it was finally breathing again after a very long time. William and Harry walked on either side of their father, their shoulders touching as they moved through the grand hallways where they used to play hide-and-seek, and they felt as though their mother was walking right there with them, her laughter echoing in the quiet spaces. They knew that there would still be hard days ahead, and that the world would never stop watching their every move, but they were no longer afraid because they were no longer alone in their grief or their duty. The sun was beginning to peek through the clouds far away on the horizon, casting a faint, hopeful glow over the city of London, and the three men looked toward the windows with a sense of peace that they hadn't felt since the world was much younger. They had faced the ghosts of the past and had come out stronger on the other side, proving that even the strongest palace walls can be moved by the power of a son's love and the courage to tell the truth. The transition from the grand, cold balcony to the quiet warmth of the private dining room felt like waking up from a wild, beautiful dream, and stepping into a safe, glowing sanctuary. After they had quickly changed out of their soaking wet, heavy clothes into soft, dry sweaters and warm trousers that smelled of home, the two brothers and their father gathered around a small, circular wooden table in a cozy corner of the palace that felt more like a real kitchen than a cold, royal museum. The smell of hot, steaming tea and fresh toasted bread filled the air, and for the first time in a very long time, there were no stiff servants or stern advisors standing in the corners to listen to their every word or judge their every move. They sat together in the golden, flickering glow of a small fire that crackled happily in the stone hearth. And as they pulled out their tablets and phones to see what the world was saying, the true, massive scale of what they had just done began to sink into their minds like a giant, wonderful weight. Every single news channel in every country, from the busy streets of New York to the quiet villages of Japan, was showing the video of them standing together in the pouring rain. And the internet was overflowing with millions upon millions of messages from regular people who were crying with pure happiness because they felt like a broken piece of the world had finally been fixed. William pointed to a headline on a major news site that called it, "The Night the Heart of the Monarchy Returned." And he felt a surge of incredible pride that made his tired eyes shine with a new light, knowing that the men in gray suits were probably sitting in their dark offices in total shock, because their old, dusty rules had been shattered by the simple power of brotherly love. Harry leaned forward, his face lit by the orange firelight, and read a heartfelt comment from a woman in a tiny village far away who said that seeing the brothers together made her believe in the power of family again. And in that moment, all the pain and loneliness of the last few years felt like it was finally worth it for this 1 second of truth. King Charles watched his sons with a quiet, peaceful smile on his face, slowly sipping his tea and realizing that the giant, shaking roar of the crowd he had heard earlier was not a threat to his crown or his power, but a beautiful celebration of the honesty that his sons had been brave enough to show to the world. They talked late into the night about how the entire planet had changed in just a few short hours, and how the memory of Diana was now a strong, golden bridge that connected the palace to the hearts of the people, in a way it never had been before. The scary tension of the day was completely gone, replaced by a deep and comfortable bond that made the small room feel like the safest place on earth. And as the large grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight with a deep, slow ring, the three men realized that they weren't just surviving a family crisis anymore, but they were starting a brand new story that the whole world was finally ready and excited to read. When the first light of the morning sun finally began to peek over the tall, jagged buildings of London, it didn't look like a normal sunrise. It felt like a brand new world was being born out of the gray shadows and the heavy rain of the night before. The giant, dark clouds that had poured water over the palace had finally drifted away, leaving the sky in a beautiful shade of soft pink and bright gold that reflected off the thousands of wet umbrellas and the piles of colorful flowers still stacked against the iron gates. Prince William and Prince Harry stood together at a large window, watching the city wake up and seeing that the crowd outside had not gone home to sleep, but had actually grown even larger as people from all over the country traveled through the night just to be near the palace on this historic day. The brothers were dressed simply in dark suits, their faces looking refreshed after a few hours of sleep, but their hearts were racing with a mixture of excitement and a little bit of nervous energy as they prepared for what they had to do next. They knew that standing on a high balcony was one thing, but walking right into the middle of the crowd to touch the hands of the people and hear their stories was a much bigger challenge that would require all the courage their mother had ever taught them. King Charles joined them at the window, his hand resting on the latch, and he told them that he had never seen the people so happy or so peaceful in all his years as a prince or a king, and he gave them a final nod of encouragement before they headed toward the grand entrance of the palace. As the massive, gold-studded front doors of the palace swung open with a slow and heavy creak, the sound of the crowd waiting at the end of the long driveway rose up into a deafening roar of cheers and clapping that echoed off the stone walls like a beautiful song of welcome. William and Harry walked side by side down the red gravel path, their footsteps steady and their heads held high, and as they got closer to the gates, they could see the thousands of faces pressed against the bars, many of them wet with tears of joy. When the heavy iron gates finally pulled back to let the brothers out, it felt like a giant wall had been removed between the royal family and the rest of the world. and the two men were instantly surrounded by a sea of reaching hands and voices calling out their names. They didn't hurry past the people or stay behind their security guards, but instead, they stopped and spent a long time leaning over the railings, shaking hands, hugging people who were crying, and listening to the stories of how Princess Diana had changed their lives many years ago. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of the millions of lilies and roses that covered the ground, and the brothers moved through the crowd like two anchors of hope in a world that had been feeling very dark and lonely for a long time. One elderly woman, who was wearing a faded pin with Diana's face on her coat, reached out and grabbed William's hand, her voice shaking as she told him that she had waited 27 years to see the two brothers together again, and that she could finally die in peace now that the princess's boys were home. Harry leaned down to talk to a small child who was holding a single sunflower, the same kind of flower his mother used to love so much. And as he took the flower and tucked it into his jacket, he felt a surge of emotion that made him realize this was exactly where he was supposed to be. The men in gray suits watched from the high windows of the palace in total silence, their faces full of wonder because they finally realized that the power of the monarchy didn't come from the gold or the titles, but from this simple, honest connection between two men and the people they were born to serve. For hours, the brothers walked among the crowds, moving slowly through the streets of London as the sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the city into a shimmering landscape of gold and hope that felt like a dream come true. Every person they spoke to and every hand they held was a brick in the new foundation they were building for their family. And as the morning turned into afternoon, the brothers realized that they were no longer just survivors of a tragedy, but they were the leaders of a new kind of kingdom where love was the most important law of all. The golden sun was high in the brilliant blue sky now, casting long and warm shadows over the city as Prince William and Prince Harry moved away from the loud, cheering crowds at the main palace gates, and began a much more private and quiet journey toward the place that held the most memories for them both. They traveled toward the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, a special and secret place that had been transformed into a beautiful sea of green and color to honor their mother. And as they walked through the heavy iron gates, the air suddenly became very still and quiet, as if the rest of the world had stopped to watch them. This was the place where they had spent so many afternoons as little boys, running through the grass and playing games while their mother laughed and watched them from the shade of the tall trees, and every step they took on the soft, mossy path felt like they were walking back in time to a much happier world. The garden was filled with thousands of white flowers, her favorite forget-me-nots, and sweet-smelling roses that filled the air with a scent so powerful it made the brothers close their eyes and imagine for a second that she was standing right there beside them. They walked slowly toward the large bronze statue of Diana that stood in the very center of the garden, showing her with her arms around two children. And as they reached the base of the statue, the two men stopped and stood in a deep, respectful silence that was more powerful than any words they had spoken all day. They looked up at the face of the statue, seeing the familiar smile and the kind eyes that had been captured in the metal. And for a long time, neither William nor Harry said a single word as the memories of her soft voice and her warm hugs came rushing back into their minds. It was a very emotional moment, a final piece of the puzzle that had been missing from their lives, and as they stood there together, the heavy weight of the last 27 years of sadness and secrets seemed to melt away under the warm afternoon sun. But then, just as William reached out to place a small bouquet of white lilies at the feet of the statue, something truly strange and beautiful happened that made everyone in the garden, including the secret security guards, stop perfectly still in their tracks. A single dark cloud that had been hiding the sun for a brief moment suddenly split apart, and a brilliant, blinding beam of pure white light shot down from the sky, hitting the bronze statue of Diana so perfectly that it looked like she was suddenly glowing with a fire of her own. At that exact same second, a tiny, bright white butterfly, the kind that people often say is a sign of a soul that has found peace, fluttered out from the flowers and began to circle slowly around the two brothers, landing for just a heartbeat on William's shoulder before flying up toward the sky. The crowd of people who were watching from far behind the garden fences let out a soft, collective gasp of wonder, and many people began to point up at the sky, where a faint, shimmering rainbow was starting to form even though there was no rain falling at all. It felt like a magic trick from the universe, a special sign that was meant only for the two brothers to tell them that their mother was watching from somewhere far away, and that she was finally happy and proud of the brave thing they had done for her. William and Harry looked at each other, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and incredible joy. And for the first time in their lives, they truly felt like the long, dark winter of their grief was over, and a bright, new spring was beginning for them both. They didn't need to be kings or dukes in that moment. They were just two sons who had finally found the peace they had been searching for since they were children, and the garden felt like it was filled with a warm, loving energy that wrapped around them like a giant hug from the past. As the white butterfly disappeared into the bright light of the sun, and the beam of light faded back into the normal afternoon glow, the brothers realized that their mission was complete and that the world would never be the same again. They walked out of the garden hand in hand, their hearts feeling light and their spirits feeling strong, ready to go back to the palace and lead their family into a future that was finally built on the truth and the endless power of a mother's love. The walk back from the secret garden to the heart of the palace felt like a victory march, even though the two brothers moved quietly and without any fanfare, because they could still feel the warmth of that strange, beautiful light and the soft touch of the white butterfly on their shoulders. When they entered the grand council chamber, a room filled with massive oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and a long table made of dark, polished wood that had seen the signing of wars and treaties, the atmosphere was completely different than it had been just 24 hours before. The men in gray suits were all there, standing in a stiff line against the tall windows, but they no longer looked like the powerful, scary bosses of the palace. Instead, they looked like tired, defeated men who knew that their time of keeping secrets and making cold rules was finally coming to an end. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his face looking more relaxed and peaceful than anyone had seen it in years, and in front of him lay a thick stack of white papers that would officially turn the brothers' dream into a permanent law for the entire British monarchy. The room was so quiet that you could hear the soft ticking of the golden clock on the mantel and the distant, happy cheers of the crowd that was still celebrating outside the palace gates, waiting for the news that would change everything. William and Harry took their seats on either side of their father, their presence filling the room with a new kind of energy that made the old advisors blink and look away, realizing that the young princes were now the ones in charge of the family's destiny. The head advisor, the man who had tried so hard to stop Harry from landing and had fought against the tribute to Diana, stepped forward with a shaking hand and placed a heavy silver fountain pen onto the table, his voice a low and humble murmur as he began to read the new rules out loud. He spoke about the creation of the Diana Foundation, a permanent part of the crown that would give millions of pounds to the poor and the sick, and he read the words that said the monarchy would now be a place of openness, honesty, and heart, rather than a place of shadows and silence. As the words filled the room, William and Harry looked at each other and shared a small, knowing smile, because they knew that every sentence on those pages was a way of bringing their mother's spirit into the very laws of the land. King Charles picked up the heavy pen first, his fingers steady as he signed his name at the bottom of the first page, and as the ink dried on the paper, it felt as though a giant, invisible chain that had been holding the family back for decades finally snapped and fell away. Then it was William's turn, and as he signed his name with a bold and proud stroke, he thought about how happy his mother would be to know that her sons were using their power to help the world just like she always wanted them to do. Finally, the pen was handed to Harry, and as he added his signature to the document, he felt a sense of belonging and peace that made him realize he was no longer an outsider, but a vital part of a family that was finally whole and healthy again. The men in gray suits watched in total silence as the papers were gathered up and stamped with the royal seal, a loud thump that sounded like the closing of an old, sad book and the opening of a bright, new one that the whole world would get to read. The king then stood up and did something that no one in the room expected. He walked over to the advisors and thanked them for their service, but he told them very clearly that from now on, the palace would be run by the heart instead of the rulebook, and he invited them to either join the new mission or find a new place to work. It was a powerful moment of leadership that showed the king was finally free from the fear of the past, and he looked at his sons with eyes that were full of a deep, fatherly love that didn't need any royal titles to be understood. The brothers stood up and shook hands with the men they had been fighting with for so long, showing a kindness and a grace that was exactly like the way their mother used to treat people, even those who were mean to her. As they walked out of the council chamber together, leaving the old world of gray suits and cold secrets behind them, they felt as though the very air in the palace was fresher and easier to breathe. as if the spirit of Diana had finally blown all the dust out of the hallways. They knew that the news of the signed papers would reach the world in just a few minutes, and they were ready to step into the future as a united family, a family that was no longer afraid of its own heart, and was finally ready to lead with the same love that a mother once gave to her two little boys. The moment the final royal seal was pressed into the thick white paper with a loud and final thump, a team of young media assistants in the palace office, people who were now smiling instead of looking worried, hit a single button on a computer that sent the official Diana Charter out into the digital world at the speed of light. In an instant, the news didn't just trickle out. It exploded across every television screen, every smartphone, and every glowing billboard from the busy, neon streets of Tokyo to the quiet, sunny beaches of California, telling the entire planet that the British monarchy had officially changed its heart forever. The message was simple and beautiful, written in words that everyone could understand, saying that from this day forward, the royal family would be a family of the people, for the people, and led by the same love and kindness that Princess Diana had given to the world all those years ago. Outside the tall, gold-tipped gates of Buckingham Palace, the sound of thousands of people checking their phones at the same time created a strange, humming noise that lasted for only a second before a giant, thunderous roar of pure, unfiltered joy erupted from the crowd and shook the very air like a physical force. People who had been strangers just a few minutes before began to hug each other and cry with happiness, their faces lit up by the glow of their screens as they realized that the people's princess was finally being given the place of honor she had always deserved in the house of her children. The celebration was not just happening in London, but was spreading like a warm, golden fire across the entire globe, turning the day into a giant party for the human spirit. In the parts of Africa where Diana had once walked through dangerous minefields to protect children, villages of people who had never forgotten her smile began to dance and sing in the streets, feeling as though a long-lost sister had finally been honored by her family. In hospitals where she had sat with the lonely and the sick, the news brought a sense of peace and hope to people who needed to believe that kindness was the strongest power in the world. Famous landmarks all over the earth began to change their colors in a show of respect. The Eiffel Tower in Paris shone with a soft, warm light that reminded people of her grace, and the giant fountains in New York City sprayed water high into the air in a celebration of the two brothers who had been brave enough to fix their family's broken heart. The news cycle, which was usually full of mean stories and scary arguments, was suddenly filled with nothing but images of the two brothers on the balcony and the smiling face of the mother who had guided them there. And for the first time in a generation, the world felt like it was finally breathing together in a moment of true, honest healing. Inside the palace, Prince William and Prince Harry stood by a large window and watched as the men in gray suits brought in tablets showing the live feeds of the celebrations from every continent, and the brothers felt a sense of awe that made their hands shake with emotion. They saw the giant crowds in Sydney, Australia, cheering under the stars, and they saw the people in Canada waving flags with Diana's picture on them, and they realized that their mother's reach was even bigger and more powerful than they had ever imagined. Every message of love and every video of people dancing in the streets felt like a warm breeze blowing through the old, dusty hallways of the palace, cleaning out the last of the sadness and the secrets that had been hiding there for 27 years. King Charles walked up behind his sons, his eyes bright with a new kind of light, and he told them that he had never seen the world so united and so happy in all his long life, and he admitted that he had been wrong to be afraid of the truth for so long. The men in gray suits were now scurrying around to answer thousands of calls from world leaders who wanted to send their congratulations, but the atmosphere was no longer frantic and scary. It was full of a deep, quiet pride that made everyone in the palace walk a little bit taller. As the sun began to set on this historic day, casting long, golden shadows across the millions of flowers at the gates, the world felt like it was resting in a new kind of peace, a peace that was built on the foundation of a mother's love and the courage of her two sons. The Diana Charter was no longer just a piece of paper sitting on a desk, but it was a living, breathing promise that the monarchy would never go back to being cold or hidden again, and that the Queen of Hearts would always be the true guide for the kings of the future. The brothers knew that their work was only just beginning and that they had many big tasks ahead to make their mother's dream a reality. But they were no longer tired or afraid because they knew they had the support of the entire planet behind them. They looked out at the glowing city of London, listening to the distant, happy sounds of the people still celebrating in the parks and the streets, and they felt a profound sense of satisfaction that made them feel like they could finally sleep without any bad dreams. The ghost of the past had finally been turned into a bright light for the future, and as the stars began to twinkle in the clear sky above the palace, the world knew that the story of Diana was no longer a tragedy, but a beautiful, ongoing legend of hope that would never end as long as her sons were there to lead the way. The ink on the Diana Charter was barely dry when Prince William and Prince Harry decided that they could not spend another minute sitting inside the quiet, golden rooms of the palace, while the world was waiting for them to put their mother's heart into action. They knew that the people didn't just want to see them sign papers or make speeches. They wanted to see them walk the same dusty paths and touch the same lives that their mother had touched so many years ago. With a sense of excitement and purpose that they hadn't felt in their entire adult lives, the two brothers began to plan their very first joint humanitarian mission under the new rules, choosing a place that was perhaps the most famous and dangerous symbol of Princess Diana's bravery. They decided to travel together to the country of Angola, far across the ocean in Africa, to the exact same spot where their mother had once walked through a field of deadly landmines while wearing a heavy blue vest and a clear plastic face shield. The men in gray suits had tried to suggest a safer, easier trip to a nearby city, but William and Harry stood firm and told them that if they were going to lead with their hearts, they had to go to the places where the work was the hardest and the people were the most forgotten. They spent the night before their flight looking through old, grainy photographs of their mother in the sun-drenched fields of Angola, seeing the look of fierce love and determination in her eyes, and they promised each other that they would finish the work she had started before they were even old enough to understand it. When the royal jet took off from the small, private airfield just outside of London, it didn't feel like the stuffy and formal trips of the past. But instead, the cabin was filled with a new kind of energy and a team of young doctors, landmine experts, and charity workers who were all buzzing with a shared mission. William and Harry sat together at a small table in the back of the plane, their maps and notebooks spread out before them, talking late into the night about how they could use the power of the new Diana Foundation to finally clear every single mine from the beautiful hills of Angola. As the plane flew over the dark, shimmering waters of the Atlantic Ocean and the millions of stars twinkled outside the window, the brothers felt a deep sense of connection to each other that went beyond just being family. They were now partners in a giant, global project to save lives. They talked about the children they were going to meet, the ones who had lost limbs to the hidden bombs in the ground, and they felt a sharp, painful ache in their chests because they knew their mother would have been right there with them, holding those children's hands and telling them they were not alone. Harry looked at the heavy blue halo vest that was resting on the seat next to him, the same kind of vest his mother had worn, and he felt a surge of courage that made him realize he was no longer afraid of his own destiny as long as he was walking in her footsteps. As the sun began to rise over the vast, red earth of the African continent, casting a long and golden light over the tall trees and the winding rivers, the plane began its slow descent toward the dusty runway of a small, remote town. From high above, they could see the thousands of people who had gathered to welcome them, their colorful clothes looking like a giant, beautiful flower garden in the middle of the dry land. When the wheels finally touched the ground with a soft bump, and the cabin door opened to let in the hot, dry air that smelled of wood smoke and wild grass, William and Harry stepped out together, squinting against the brilliant sunlight that seemed to reflect the hope in their own hearts. They didn't see a crowd of strangers, but they saw a sea of friends who remembered their mother's smile and who had been waiting 27 years for her sons to return and finish the job of making their home safe again. The sound of the people singing and playing drums rose up to meet them, a powerful and rhythmic beat that felt like the heartbeat of the land itself. And as the brothers walked down the metal stairs, they felt a profound sense of peace. They knew that the eyes of the entire world were watching them, but they didn't care about the cameras or the headlines anymore. They only cared about the feeling of the dusty earth beneath their boots and the promise they were about to keep to the mother who had taught them that the greatest crown a person can wear is the one made of kindness and service to others. The heat of the African sun was unlike anything the brothers had felt back in the gray, rainy streets of London, as it beat down on their shoulders with a heavy, golden weight that seemed to bake the very air they were breathing. Prince William and Prince Harry stood at the edge of a long, narrow path that cut through a field of tall, yellow grass, and their hearts were thumping in their chests as they looked at the small, red signs with white skulls that warned of the deadly landmines still hiding beneath the dust. They slowly reached for the heavy, bright blue safety vests and the thick, clear plastic face shields that the experts handed to them. And as they buckled the straps and felt the weight of the protective gear, they shared a long, silent look of deep understanding. This was the exact spot where their mother had stood 27 years ago, a brave and lonely figure in a world that didn't understand her mission. And as William took the first step onto the red earth, he felt as though he were stepping directly into his mother's footprints. The sound of their boots crunching on the dry ground was the only noise in the quiet field, and every step they took felt like a heartbeat, a slow and steady pulse of courage that connected the past to the present in a way that made the hair on their arms stand up. They weren't just walking through a dangerous field. They were walking through the memories of their childhood and the legacy of the woman who had taught them that being a prince was about serving those who were the most afraid. As they reached the middle of the path, where the grass was thin and the dust swirled in little orange clouds around their feet, they saw a woman standing near a small, modern schoolhouse that had been built on land that used to be too dangerous to touch. She was a tall, elegant woman with a warm and beautiful smile that seemed to light up her entire face, and as she watched the two brothers approach, her eyes filled with tears of pure, honest joy. This was Sandra, the same girl who had been pictured sitting on Princess Diana's lap all those years ago after losing her leg to a hidden bomb. And as she reached out to take the brothers' hands, it felt as though a circle of love that had been broken for decades was finally being closed. She spoke to them in a soft, musical voice, telling them that their mother's visit had given her the strength to live, and that she had spent her whole life waiting for the day when the princess's boys would return to see the beautiful, safe world their mother had dreamed of. William and Harry sat with her on a simple wooden bench, ignoring the cameras and the heat, and they listened to her stories of how the field they were standing in was now a place where children played soccer and families grew their food without any fear. It was a life-changing encounter that made the brothers realize that the work of the heart is never truly finished, but is passed down from one generation to the next like a precious and glowing torch. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, turning the red dust into a shimmering landscape of fire and gold, and the brothers felt a profound sense of peace wash over them as they looked at the school and the happy children running through the grass. They realized that by coming to this place together, they had done more than just honor their mother. They had shown the world that the Diana Way was a path of real, tangible change that could turn a field of death into a garden of hope. Harry reached out and touched the rough wood of the schoolhouse wall, thinking about how his mother would have loved the sound of the children's laughter, and he felt a tear of happiness track down his cheek behind his plastic shield. They spent hours talking to the villagers and the landmine clearers, learning about the thousands of bombs that had already been removed thanks to the Foundation's work, and they promised that they would not stop until every single red sign was gone from the hills of Angola. As they finally walked back toward their waiting vehicle, leaving the field behind but carrying the stories in their hearts, the brothers knew that this was just the beginning of their new life. They felt stronger and more united than they had ever been, knowing that as long as they walked side by side in the dust and the sun, the spirit of Princess Diana would be there to guide their every step toward a brighter and kinder future for the entire world. After leaving the dusty lowlands where the landmines had once slept in the dark, Prince William and Prince Harry traveled even deeper into the heart of the country, where the land began to rise up into tall, emerald-green mountains that touched the very belly of the clouds. The journey was long and difficult, with their rugged vehicles bouncing over narrow, rocky paths that wound around steep cliffs. But the brothers didn't complain about the bumps or the heat, because they felt a strange pull toward a small, hidden village that wasn't even on most maps. They had heard whispers from the local people about a secret place high in the hills, a place that the villagers had kept quiet for 27 years out of a deep and sacred respect for the woman who had once visited them in their time of greatest need. As the air became cooler and the scent of wild mountain flowers filled the breeze, the brothers finally saw a cluster of small, straw-roofed huts nestled in a high valley. And as they stepped out of their cars, the entire village came out to meet them in a silence that was so respectful it felt like being in a great cathedral. An old man with skin as wrinkled as a walnut and eyes that were wise and kind stepped forward, leaning on a wooden staff, and he told the brothers that he had been waiting for the day when the princes of the sun would return to see the gift the village had built with their own bare hands. He led William and Harry up a winding trail that was lined with smooth white river stones, and as they reached a flat ledge that looked out over the entire beautiful valley, the brothers stopped and caught their breath in total amazement. There, standing against the bright blue sky, was a secret memorial that the villagers had built for Princess Diana using only the things they could find in the mountains. It wasn't a cold statue made of metal like the ones in London, but it was a beautiful shrine made of stacked red stones, carved dark wood, and thousands of colorful beads that shimmered in the sunlight like tiny jewels. In the center of the stones, someone had carefully carved a picture of Diana's face into a flat piece of rock, and even though it was simple, it captured the sparkle in her eyes and the kindness of her smile so perfectly that it made Harry's heart feel like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. The old man explained that when Diana had visited them during the war, she had brought medicine and hope when no one else would come so high into the mountains. And after she passed away, every man, woman, and child in the village had carried a stone up the hill to build this place so they would never forget her. The brothers stood in front of the handmade shrine, the wind whistling through the tall grass around them like a soft, haunting song, and they realized that their mother's love had reached into corners of the world that the men in gray suits didn't even know existed. They saw small, dried bundles of flowers and tiny clay bowls of water that the villagers had placed at the foot of the memorial that very morning, showing that her memory was still a living, breathing part of their daily lives. William reached out and touched the rough red stones, feeling the warmth of the sun that they had soaked up, and he felt a deep sense of humility knowing that these people, who had so little, had given so much of their time and effort to honor a woman they had only met for one short day. Harry sat on the ground and looked out at the valley, thinking about how his mother would have preferred this quiet, hidden place of stone and wind over any of the grand palaces in England. They spent the afternoon sitting with the villagers, sharing a simple meal of corn and fruit, and listening to the elders tell stories of how the lady in the blue vest had sat on the dirt floors of their huts and listened to their problems as if she were their own daughter. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, purple shadows over the secret shrine, the brothers felt a connection to their mother that was deeper and more spiritual than anything they had felt before. They realized that her legacy wasn't just about the big charities or the famous photographs, but it was about these tiny, quiet acts of kindness that had planted seeds of love in the hearts of people thousands of miles away. When it was time to leave, the old man gave each of the brothers a small, hand-carved wooden bird to remind them that their mother's spirit was free and flying over the mountains, watching over them as they continued her work. William and Harry walked back down the trail in a comfortable, thoughtful silence, their hearts full of the stories they had heard and the beauty they had seen in that hidden valley. They knew that the world would never see this secret memorial, but that made it even more special to them, like a private treasure they could keep in their hearts to give them strength whenever the world felt too loud or too difficult. As their vehicles moved away from the village and back toward the world of news and noise, the brothers looked back one last time at the high ledge, seeing the red stones of the shrine glowing like a tiny, eternal flame in the darkness of the mountains. As the royal jet descended through the thick, gray clouds and finally touched down on the rain-slicked runway in London, the two brothers did not know that a new and very difficult kind of battle was already waiting for them behind the closed doors of the palace. The journey home from the warm sun of Africa had been a quiet and thoughtful one, with both William and Harry feeling a deep sense of peace from their time in the hidden mountains. But the moment they stepped off the plane, the cold English air felt different and full of a strange, biting tension. They didn't see the usual friendly faces of their helpers, but instead, they were met by a group of serious-looking men who seemed to be hiding something behind their stiff postures and their polite, fake smiles. As the brothers traveled back to the palace in the dark, quiet car, they noticed that the city felt different too, as if the excitement of the Diana Charter was being pushed back into the shadows by someone who wanted to return to the old, cold ways of doing things. When they finally walked through the grand entrance of the palace, the first thing they noticed was that the beautiful photographs of their mother that had been placed in the main hallway were gone, replaced by the old, dark paintings of kings who looked like they hadn't smiled in 100 years. It was a clear sign that while the princes were away trying to do good in the world, the men in gray suits had been busy trying to regain their control and erase the changes that had been made during that one magical night of truth. The two brothers found the head advisor standing in the grand library, a room filled with thousands of dusty old books and the smell of ancient paper, and he was holding a stack of files with a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He spoke to them in a voice that was as dry as a desert, telling them that the traditions of the crown were much stronger than any one person's feelings, and that it was time for the monarchy to go back to being a place of quiet duty instead of public emotion. He explained that they had canceled the new charity meetings and had told the news reporters that the Diana Charter was just a temporary idea that needed to be studied for many more years before it could actually happen. The advisor thought that because the brothers were tired from their long trip, they would simply give up and go along with the old rules. But he did not realize that William and Harry were no longer the same men who had left London a few weeks ago. They carried the fire of the African sun in their spirits and the memory of the secret mountain shrine in their hearts, and they were not about to let a group of men in gray suits tell them how to honor their own mother. The room felt like a battlefield, with the old guard of the palace on one side and the two brothers on the other, and the air was so thick with anger that it felt like it might burst into flames at any second. William stepped forward into the center of the library, his voice sounding like rolling thunder in the quiet room, and he told the advisor that the Diana Charter was not a suggestion or a temporary phase, but it was a sacred promise that would never be broken as long as he was alive. He demanded that every single photo of his mother be put back in its place immediately, and that the charity meetings be rescheduled for the very next morning, or the advisor would find himself without a job and without a home before the sun went down. Harry stood right beside his brother, his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes shining with a fierce, protective light that showed he was ready to fight anyone who tried to stand in their way. The advisors looked at each other in total shock, their faces turning a pale shade of gray as they realized that the two brothers were no longer divided by secrets or jealousy, but were a solid wall of strength that could not be moved or broken. They saw that the men in gray suits had lost their power to control the story, because the brothers were finally leading with their hearts and were no longer afraid of the consequences of telling the truth to the world. The king entered the room just as the advisor was about to speak again, and for a moment, everyone held their breath to see which side he would take in this final, desperate struggle for the soul of the palace. Charles looked at the angry, worried faces of his advisors, and then he looked at the strong, united faces of his two sons, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face as he realized that the old ways were truly gone forever. He told the advisors that the brothers were right, and that the palace would never go back to being a place of shadows, because the light that Diana had started was now burning too brightly to be put out by a few cold words or a stack of dusty files. The head advisor bowed his head in a sign of complete defeat, realizing that he had lost the battle for the monarchy and that the future belonged to the two men standing in front of him. As the brothers walked out of the library and back into the main hallway to help put their mother's pictures back on the walls, they felt a profound sense of victory that made them feel like they could finally relax. They had proven that even when they were away, their mother's legacy was strong enough to survive, and as they worked together to fix the palace, they knew that no one would ever be brave enough to try and hide her heart from the world again. The grand ballroom of the palace, a room that for hundreds of years had been used only for stiff, formal parties where everyone wore uncomfortable clothes and spoke in hushed whispers, was completely transformed into a place of light, laughter, and real human warmth for the first big event of the Diana Charter. Instead of only inviting rich lords and powerful world leaders, Prince William and Prince Harry had filled the massive room with the real heroes of the world, the nurses who worked all night in crowded hospitals, the teachers who helped children in poor neighborhoods, and the brave landmine clearers they had met under the hot sun of Angola. The long, golden tables were decorated with simple wildflowers and candles that made the room feel like a cozy home instead of a cold museum, and the smell of fresh bread and roasted vegetables replaced the old, dusty scent that usually hung in the air of the royal house. The men in gray suits watched from the balconies in total amazement, their mouths hanging open as they saw the future king and his brother walking among the tables, sitting down to eat with regular people, and listening to their stories with a genuine interest that you could see in their eyes. There was no high stage and no secret corners for the royals to hide in, because the brothers wanted to show the world that the palace now belonged to everyone who had a kind heart and a desire to make the world a better place. As the dinner went on, a young woman who had spent her whole life helping homeless people in the cold streets of London stood up to speak, her voice trembling with emotion as she thanked the brothers for finally opening the palace doors to the people who were usually ignored. She told a story about how she once met Princess Diana at a shelter many years ago, and how the princess had sat on the floor with her, sharing a cup of tea, and making her feel like the most important person in the room. When she said that seeing William and Harry together made her feel like that same kindness had returned to the world, a deep and powerful silence fell over the ballroom, and even the most serious guards felt a tear of joy prick at their eyes. William stood up and walked over to give the woman a hug, breaking every old rule about how a prince should act, and the entire room erupted in a roar of applause that was so loud it could be heard all the way down the street where the public was watching on big screens. This was the first real fruit of the Diana Charter, a moment where the monarchy stopped being a distant and scary institution and became a living, breathing part of the human family, just as their mother had always dreamed it would be. The news cameras that were allowed inside to film the event sent these images to every corner of the planet, and people watching at home felt a sense of hope and connection that they hadn't felt in a very long time. They saw King Charles laughing with a group of doctors from a small village, and they saw Queen Camilla talking softly to a young man who was an advocate for mental health, proving that the entire family was finally moving together toward a brighter and more honest future. The men in gray suits realized that they could never go back to the old ways because the people had seen the truth, and the truth was much more beautiful and powerful than any secret or any ancient tradition. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to leave, they each received a small, hand-painted card with a quote from Diana about the power of a random act of kindness, a tiny treasure to remind them that they were now part of the royal story too. William and Harry stood at the grand exit, shaking every single hand and promising that this was only the beginning of many more nights where the palace would be filled with the voices of the people. They felt a profound sense of satisfaction as they watched the last of the guests walk down the red gravel path, knowing that they had finally turned their mother's legacy into a living, breathing reality that would nourish the world for generations to come. The morning after the grand dinner, a soft and peaceful quiet settled over the palace, as if the very buildings were resting after the incredible energy and joy of the night before. Prince William and Prince Harry were sitting together in a small, sun-drenched breakfast room, sharing a pot of tea and talking quietly about the many people they had met, when a trusted old servant entered the room carrying a silver tray with a single, unusual letter on it. This was not a fancy, official letter with a royal seal, but a simple, cream-colored envelope that looked like it had been tucked away in a drawer for a very long time, with handwriting that was elegant and familiar, yet belonging to someone the brothers had not heard from in decades. The servant whispered that a woman had left it at the back gate very early that morning, refusing to give her name, but insisting that only the princess's boys should ever lay eyes on its contents. With a curious and slightly nervous feeling in his chest, William reached out and took the letter, noticing that it smelled faintly of the same lilies their mother used to love. And as he carefully slid the paper out of the envelope, a small, old photograph fell onto the table, showing a younger Princess Diana standing in front of a beautiful, unfinished stone building in a place that looked like a magical, hidden forest. The letter was from a woman named Sarah, a long-lost friend who had been one of Diana's most secret and trusted helpers during the very last year of her life. And as the brothers began to read her words, they felt as though their mother's voice was reaching out to them from across the years. Sarah wrote that in the final months before the tragic accident in Paris, Diana had been secretly building a special sanctuary, a garden of healing, for children who had lost their families and had nowhere else to go. She had kept the project a total secret from the men in gray suits and the news reporters because she wanted it to be a place of pure peace, away from the flashing cameras and the loud noise of the world. But the project had been stopped and abandoned the moment she was gone. The letter explained that the building was hidden deep in the ancient woods of a quiet valley far away from London, and that it had been slowly covered by vines and forgot by everyone except for a few local people who still remembered the kind lady who used to visit them in the middle of the night. As William and Harry looked at the old photograph and read the heartfelt words, a new and powerful fire of determination lit up in their eyes, because they realized that their mother had left them one final, secret task to complete. They felt a deep, emotional pull toward this hidden sanctuary, knowing that finishing it would be the ultimate way to prove that her heart was still beating inside the work they were doing today. They didn't need to say a word to each other to know what they had to do. They were going to find this garden of healing and turn it into the beautiful home that their mother had dreamed of for the children who needed it most. The palace advisors would likely try to tell them it was too difficult or that the building was too old to be saved, but the brothers were no longer afraid of what the men in gray suits thought about their choices. They stood up from the table, clutching the letter and the photograph like they were the most valuable treasures in the world, ready to start a brand new quest into the forgotten parts of their mother's life. This was a mystery that went beyond the Diana Charter and the official royal duties, as it was a personal mission of love that connected them directly to the private dreams of the woman they missed so much. They knew that the journey would lead them into the wild and quiet places of the country, far away from the gold and the marble of the palace, but that was exactly where they wanted to be. As they walked out of the room to tell the king about their discovery, the brothers felt as though a new chapter of their story was beginning, one that would uncover a secret piece of history that had been waiting 27 years for the right people to find it. They felt a profound sense of excitement and wonder, realizing that even after all this time, their mother still had surprises left for them, and they were ready to follow the clues she had left behind to build a future that was even more beautiful than they had ever imagined. The morning air was crisp and cool as Prince William and Prince Harry left the grand gates of the palace behind, traveling in a simple, rugged car that didn't have any royal flags or loud sirens, because they wanted to disappear into the heart of the countryside like two regular travelers on a secret mission. They drove for hours as the busy city streets turned into rolling green hills, and the tall buildings were replaced by ancient, towering trees that seemed to lean over the road as if they were guarding a great mystery. Following the old, hand-drawn map that had been tucked inside Sarah's letter, they finally reached a narrow, dirt path that was almost hidden by thick bushes and tall, waving grass. And as they stepped out of the car, the only sound they could hear was the soft singing of birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The forest felt old and magical, filled with the smell of damp earth and blooming wildflowers, and as the brothers began to walk deeper into the woods, they felt a strange and powerful sense of peace, as if the trees themselves were welcoming them home to a place they had always been meant to find. They had to push aside heavy branches and step over fallen logs covered in soft, green moss, their eyes searching through the emerald shadows for any sign of the stone building they had seen in the faded photograph. Every step felt like a heartbeat, and the further they went into the silent woods, the more they felt the presence of their mother, a warm and loving energy that seemed to guide their feet toward the secret she had kept for so many years. After walking for what felt like a lifetime, the trees suddenly opened up into a wide, hidden valley where the sunlight streamed down in golden beams, and there, nestled against the side of a mossy hill, they saw a glimpse of pale stone peeking through a thick blanket of tangled vines and wild ivy. Their hearts raced as they hurried forward, their hands working together to pull away the heavy green leaves and the creeping branches that had tried to hide the building from the world for 27 long years. As the stone walls were slowly revealed, the brothers stood back in total awe, seeing a beautiful, unfinished sanctuary with large, arched windows and a wide doorway that looked like it was waiting for children to run through it with laughter and joy. It wasn't a cold or scary place, but a house that felt like a warm hug made of stone, designed with soft corners and beautiful carvings of birds and flowers that were exactly like the things Diana used to draw for them when they were little. They walked through the open doorway, their boots crunching on the dusty floor, and they saw that the inside was filled with old wooden beams and half-finished fireplaces that had been waiting for a fire to be lit since the summer of 1997. In a quiet corner near a window that looked out over a sparkling stream, William found a small, rusted metal box, and when he opened it, his breath caught in his throat as he saw a set of colorful drawings made by his mother, showing exactly how she wanted the rooms to look with soft beds, bright paintings, and a large garden where every child could feel safe and loved. Harry sat down on a stone bench that was covered in a thin layer of dust, his eyes filling with tears as he realized that this was his mother's final, most beautiful dream, a dream that had been frozen in time the moment she left the world. He could see her in his mind, walking through these very rooms with a pencil in her hand and a smile on her face, thinking about the many children she was going to save from the loneliness of the world. The brothers realized that the men in gray suits had probably tried to forget this place because it was too human and too real for their cold rules. But now that they had found it, they knew that their lives had a brand new purpose. They stood together in the center of the unfinished hall, the golden sunlight dancing on the dusty floor around them, and they made a silent, sacred vow to each other and to their mother that they would finish every single stone and every single garden exactly the way she had planned. They felt a profound sense of connection to her spirit in that quiet, hidden valley, a feeling that they were no longer just chasing a memory, but were actually working side by side with her to finish a masterpiece of love. As they walked back out into the forest, leaving the vine-covered sanctuary behind for now, they didn't feel sad or tired, but they felt a surge of incredible strength and hope that made them feel like they could move mountains to make her dream come true. When Prince William and Prince Harry arrived back at the palace, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the red gravel driveway, and the peace they had found in the ancient forest was quickly replaced by a sharp, cold feeling of trouble. They didn't even stop to wash the forest dust from their hands or change out of their rugged boots before they marched toward the king's private office, their faces set in a look of fierce determination that made the servants step back in surprise. As they reached the grand hallway, they saw a group of the men in gray suits standing outside the door, whispering in frantic voices and clutching thick black folders as if they were guarding a dirty secret. The head advisor, the man who always tried to hide Diana's memory, looked up and saw the brothers, and for a split second his face turned a ghostly shade of white before he quickly put on a fake, oily smile. William didn't wait for a polite greeting, but instead, he pulled out the old photograph of the hidden sanctuary and the drawings their mother had made, holding them up like a shield against the coldness of the palace. He demanded to know why this place had been forgotten, but the answer he got was even worse than the silence they had lived with for 27 long years. The advisor cleared his throat and said in a voice that sounded like cold metal that the land in the valley had already been marked as worthless, and that a secret deal was being made to sell it to a big company that wanted to tear down the trees and build a giant, gray warehouse. The brothers felt a surge of white-hot anger explode in their chests, a feeling that made their hands shake as they realized that these men were trying to destroy the last physical dream their mother had ever worked on. Harry stepped forward, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous kind of energy, and he told the advisors that they would have to tear the palace down stone by stone before they would ever be allowed to touch a single tree in that hidden valley. They realized that the men in gray suits hadn't just forgotten about the sanctuary. They had been waiting for the right moment to get rid of it forever, thinking that no one would ever find it or care about an old, unfinished building covered in vines. The advisor tried to argue that the monarchy needed the money from the sale and that sentimental projects were not part of the official royal business, but William cut him off with a look so sharp it could have sliced through the very air. He told them that the Diana Charter meant that the monarchy's business was now the business of the heart, and that protecting a place of healing for children was the most important duty they had ever been given. The argument grew louder and more intense, echoing through the long hallway until the heavy doors of the king's office swung open and Charles himself stepped out to see what the commotion was about. The king looked at the dusty, angry faces of his sons, and then at the nervous, sweating advisors, and he saw the beautiful drawings of the sanctuary that William was still holding tight in his hand. He took the papers and looked at them for a long time, his eyes softening as he recognized the handwriting of the woman he had once known so well, and he felt a sharp pang of regret for letting the men in gray suits make so many decisions in the dark. Charles turned to the head advisor and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of 1,000 years of power, telling him to cancel the sale of the land immediately and to bring him every single document related to the hidden valley. He told his sons that he had no idea the land was being sold, and that he was ashamed that his own advisors had tried to erase such a beautiful part of their mother's life, while he was looking the other way. The brothers felt a wave of relief wash over them, knowing that they had stopped the machines from destroying the forest just in time, but they also knew that they couldn't trust the men in gray suits anymore. They realized that the palace was still full of people who wanted to live in the past, and that the only way to protect Diana's dreams was to take the power into their own hands and never let it go again. As the advisors hurried away to fix their mistakes and stop the sale, the king invited his sons back into his office, and they spent the rest of the night planning how to turn the hidden sanctuary into a reality that would last forever. They talked about hiring the best builders and the most caring doctors to help finish the Garden of Healing, and they decided that they would use their own money to make sure it was perfect, away from the interference of the men in gray suits. The battle for the sacred land had been won, but the brothers knew that this was just one part of a much bigger war to keep their mother's spirit alive in a world that sometimes felt too cold and busy to care. They felt a profound sense of unity as they worked together under the soft glow of the lamps, three men who were finally learning how to be a real family by honoring the woman they had all loved in different ways. Outside, the moon rose over the palace, casting a silver light on the walls that no longer felt like a prison, but like a home that was finally being filled with the truth. The sun rose over the ancient forest with a brilliant, hopeful light that painted the green leaves in shades of bright orange and soft gold. And as the first group of trucks and builders arrived at the edge of the hidden path, the quiet woods were suddenly filled with the busy, happy sounds of a dream coming to life. Prince William and Prince Harry led the way, their hearts full of a nervous kind of joy as they watched the workmen carefully clear the thick vines and the heavy ivy from the pale stone walls, making sure not to damage a single piece of the building their mother had loved so much. They weren't just there to fix a house. They were there to heal a memory that had been broken for 27 years, and every person they had hired was someone who believed in the power of the Diana way and the beauty of her final, secret mission. As the dust of the years was swept away, and the sunlight finally touched the cold floors of the main hall, the sanctuary seemed to wake up from its long sleep, the air smelling of fresh cedar wood and the sweet mountain flowers that the brothers had brought to brighten the rooms. The men in gray suits were far away in their cold London offices, unable to stop the progress of a project that was now protected by the king himself, and the brothers felt a profound sense of freedom as they rolled up their sleeves and began to work alongside the builders to prepare the garden for the children who would soon call this place home. It was in the middle of the afternoon, while a young mason was carefully checking the large stone fireplace in what was going to be the main library, that a discovery was made that stopped the work and brought a deep, emotional silence to the entire valley. The worker noticed that one of the large, flat stones behind the old wooden mantel was loose, and when he pulled it away, he saw a small, tarnished copper tube tucked into a hidden hollow that had been carved specifically to keep it safe and dry. He immediately called for the princes, and as William and Harry stood in the center of the dusty room and carefully opened the tube, their hands were shaking because they knew they were holding something that had been placed there by their mother's own fingers. Inside was a piece of thick, cream-colored paper, still smelling faintly of her perfume, and as they unfolded it, they saw her elegant, looping handwriting that seemed to leap off the page with a message of hope and love for the future. It was a letter written on a quiet evening in the summer of 1997, and in the letter, Diana spoke about her fears and her dreams, explaining that she was building this sanctuary because she knew that true happiness only comes from giving to those who have nothing left to give. The brothers read the words together, their shoulders touching as the emotional weight of her voice from the past filled the room, and they felt a tear of pure connection track down their cheeks as they realized she had always known they would find it one day. She wrote that she wanted this place to be a circle of peace, where the walls were filled with music and the gardens were full of the laughter of children who had forgotten how to smile, and she asked whoever found the letter to never let the coldness of the world turn their hearts into stone. This long-buried secret was like a final blessing, a voice from the dust that told them they were exactly where they were supposed to be and that their work was the most important thing they would ever do for the crown. The builders and the assistants stood in the doorway in total silence, watching the two brothers hold the small piece of paper as if it were the most valuable treasure on the entire planet, and they realized that they were part of a story that was much bigger than just a construction project. It was a moment of pure magic that connected the past, the present, and the future into one beautiful line of light, and the brothers felt a surge of incredible strength that made them feel like they could face any challenge the palace or the world could throw at them. As the sun began to sink behind the tall trees, casting a warm, purple glow over the stone sanctuary, William and Harry sat together on the front steps, looking out at the valley and thinking about the children who would soon be sleeping safely inside these walls. They decided that they would frame the letter and place it in the center of the entrance hall, so that every person who entered the sanctuary would know that it was built on a foundation of a mother's love and a promise that was never broken. They felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that the men in gray suits could never take this away from them now, because the spirit of Princess Diana was woven into the very stones and the very air of the hidden valley. The work would continue for many months, but the discovery of the letter had changed the energy of the project, turning it from a duty into a sacred mission that would nourish their souls forever. As the moon rose over the forest, casting a silver light on the pale stone walls, the two brothers knew that they had finally found the piece of their mother's heart that they had been searching for their whole lives, and they were ready to share that heart with the rest of the world. The men in gray suits sat in their dark and cold offices deep within the back parts of the palace, their faces twisted with a desperate kind of anger, because they realized that they could not stop the two brothers with words or old traditions anymore. So they decided to use the power of money and complicated laws to try and pull the dream apart from the inside. They knew that the Garden of Healing in the hidden forest was costing a lot of money to build, and that the Diana Charter was giving away millions to help the poor. So they gathered a mountain of dusty files and called for a scary official investigation to see if the brothers were following the strict rules of the crown. It was a mean and sneaky trick, designed to make the public doubt the brothers and to make the king feel like his sons were being irresponsible with the royal fortune. And the advisors spent all night writing a long report that made every act of kindness look like a dangerous mistake. They hoped that by creating a giant mess of paperwork and bringing in stern judges to look at the bank accounts, they could freeze the funds and force the builders in the hidden valley to stop their work, leaving the sanctuary to be swallowed by the vines once again. When the news of the investigation reached Prince William and Prince Harry, they were standing in the middle of a newly planted garden at the sanctuary, their hands covered in soil and their hearts full of hope. But the sudden arrival of a cold, official letter felt like a bucket of ice water being poured over their heads. The brothers didn't waste a single second, but instead they jumped into their car and raced back to London, their minds spinning with a mixture of disbelief and a fierce, protective fire that made them feel like they were ready to face an entire army. They knew that the men in gray suits were trying to use the world of numbers and ledgers to kill a project that was made of love and dreams, and they were not going to let a group of accountants take away the house they were building for the children. When they burst into the grand meeting hall, they found the advisors sitting in a row, looking very proud of themselves as they laid out their evidence of overspending and broken protocols, their voices sounding like dry sticks breaking as they spoke about the dangers of being too emotional with the royal money. William didn't sit down, but instead he stood at the end of the long table and pulled out the ancient, handwritten letter they had found in the stone walls, showing the advisors that the Diana Charter was not just a modern idea, but was the final wish of a woman who had given her entire life to the service of the people. He told the room in a voice that was calm, but carried the weight of a rolling storm that you cannot put a price on the life of a child or the healing of a broken heart, and that every penny being spent was a penny that was finally doing the work the monarchy was always meant to do. Harry stood beside his brother, his eyes burning with a bright and steady light, as he challenged the advisors to look at the photographs of the happy people in Angola and the children who were already waiting to move into the new sanctuary. He asked the judges if they truly wanted to be the people who were remembered in history as the ones who tried to stop a mother's love with a calculator, and the room became so quiet that you could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of everyone there. Just as the head advisor was about to speak again, King Charles walked into the hall, his face set in a hard and determined look that told everyone he was no longer going to let the men in gray suits run his family behind his back. He walked up to the table, took the advisor's scary report, and without even reading it, he tore the papers in half and threw them into the fireplace, where the flames jumped up to swallow the lies and the secrets in a burst of orange light. The king told the advisors that the investigation was over before it even started, and that from this day forward, any person who tried to attack his son's work would be seen as an enemy of the crown itself. The men in gray suits were left standing in total silence, their faces pale and their hands shaking as they realized that their last and most desperate trick had failed completely, and that the power of the old world was officially gone. William and Harry felt a profound sense of relief and victory, knowing that their father had finally stood up for them, and their mother in the most public way possible, and the three men shared a look of deep, honest connection that made the grand hall feel like a real home. The news of the failed investigation spread through the palace like a happy song, and the servants and the staff began to cheer in the hallways, knowing that the era of fear and shadows was finally being replaced by an era of light and truth. The brothers realized that while there would always be people who were afraid of change, they were now strong enough to handle anything as long as they stayed united and kept their mother's letter close to their hearts. As they walked out of the hall and back toward the hidden forest to continue their work, they felt like they were no longer just building a house, but they were building a new kind of kingdom that no amount of money or gray suits could ever destroy. The day everyone had been dreaming of finally arrived under a sky so blue and clear it looked like it had been painted by an artist's hand. And the ancient forest that had once been a place of shadows was now glowing with a warm, golden light that made every leaf and flower look like a tiny treasure. The hidden sanctuary, which the brothers had found covered in vines and forgotten by time, was now a beautiful, breathing home made of pale stone and warm wood, with its large windows reflecting the dancing sunlight and its doors wide open to welcome a brand new life. Prince William and Prince Harry stood together on the front lawn, their faces bright with a mixture of exhaustion and incredible joy, as they watched the very first bus move slowly down the winding dirt path toward the house they had built with so much love. This wasn't just any group of people, but it was the first 20 children who had been chosen to live in the Garden of Healing, children who had lost their parents in wars, children who had survived scary accidents, and children who had spent their whole lives feeling like they didn't belong anywhere. As the bus came to a stop and the doors creaked open, a sudden and powerful silence fell over the valley, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the trees, the birds, and even the spirit of the forest were holding their breath to witness the miracle of a promise finally being kept. When the children stepped out onto the grass, their eyes wide with wonder and a little bit of fear as they looked at the big stone house and the beautiful gardens, William and Harry didn't stand back like formal royals, but they ran forward to meet them with big smiles and open arms. They knelt in the grass so they could look the children in the eye, shaking their small hands and telling them in soft, kind voices that this was now their home and that they would never have to be afraid or lonely ever again. One little boy from Angola, who was walking with a new, shiny prosthetic leg that the Diana Foundation had given him, looked up at William and asked if the princess with the golden hair was the one who had built the garden for him. William's eyes filled with tears of pure happiness as he nodded his head and told the boy that his mother had started the house a long time ago just for him, and that she was watching from the clouds with a giant smile on her face. This was the moment that made all the arguments with the men in gray suits, and all the long nights of planning feel like they were worth every second, because the laughter of children was finally beginning to fill the air where there had only been silence for 27 years. King Charles and Queen Camilla arrived a little while later, and as they walked through the house and saw the soft beds, the bright playrooms, and the library filled with books of fairy tales, they felt a profound sense of pride that made them realize their sons had truly changed the future of the monarchy. Even Camilla, who had been so afraid of the past for so long, felt a warm peace in her heart as she sat on a bench in the garden and watched the children playing hide-and-seek among the roses. She realized that by helping the brothers build this sanctuary, she had finally found her own place in the family's story, a place that wasn't built on competition or secrets, but on being part of something that was genuinely good and kind. The men in gray suits were not invited to the ceremony, because this day belonged only to the people who believed in the power of the heart. And as the family gathered on the front steps for a simple meal with the children, the palace in London felt like it was a million miles away. The world was watching through a few carefully placed cameras, and the images of the king, the princes, and the children sitting together on the grass sent a message of hope that reached into the living rooms of millions of people, making them feel like the world was finally a little bit brighter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and soft pink, the brothers led the children to the center of the garden where a single, beautiful tree had been planted in memory of their mother. Instead of cutting a cold, red ribbon with giant scissors, they asked each child to tie a small, colorful silk ribbon to the branches of the tree, creating a shimmering ribbon of hope that danced in the evening breeze. Every ribbon represented a dream for the future and a promise that the Garden of Healing would always be a place of love. And as the last child tied their ribbon, a sudden and gentle wind blew through the valley, making the whole tree rustle and glow in the fading light. It felt like a final, beautiful sign from Diana, a soft whisper from the past telling her sons that they had done a wonderful job and that her heart was finally at rest in the house she had always wanted to build. William and Harry stood together in the quiet of the twilight, watching the lights flicker on in the windows of the sanctuary, and they knew that their lives would never be the same again. They had turned a tragedy into a triumph and a secret into a sanctuary, and as they walked back inside to tuck the children into their new beds, they felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any crown or any throne could ever provide. The morning after the grand opening of the Garden of Healing, the sun rose over a world that felt completely different, as if the laughter of the children in the forest had somehow traveled across the oceans and touched the hearts of people in every corner of the earth. In the quiet breakfast room of the palace, Prince William and Prince Harry sat before a table piled so high with letters and telegrams that they could barely see each other over the mountains of paper. These weren't just letters of thanks or polite notes from other royals, but they were official requests from presidents, prime ministers, and leaders of small, struggling villages from every continent on the map. Every single one of them was asking for the same thing. They wanted the Diana way to come to their country, and they wanted the two brothers to help them build their own sanctuaries for children who had been forgotten by the world. It was a massive, global wave of hope that was moving faster than any news report, and the brothers realized that the small garden they had finished in the hidden valley was just the first spark in a fire that was now burning all around the planet. They felt a strange mixture of incredible pride and a heavy, sinking feeling of being overwhelmed, because they knew that two men and one small foundation could not fix the whole world in a single day, yet they couldn't bear the thought of saying no to anyone who was asking for help in their mother's name, while the brothers were trying to figure out how to handle this Diana revolution. The men in gray suits were back in their offices, and this time they weren't just angry, they were absolutely terrified. They watched the news reports showing people in distant cities march through the streets holding pictures of William and Harry, demanding that their own leaders act with the same heart and honesty that the British princes had shown. The advisors realized that the monarchy was no longer just a British tradition to be kept inside a palace, but it was becoming a global movement of kindness that was quickly moving out of their control. They hurried to the king's study, their voices high and panicked as they argued that the monarchy was meant to be for the United Kingdom only, and that trying to save the whole world was a dangerous mistake that would drain the royal bank accounts and make the family look like a charity office instead of a powerful throne. They begged King Charles to put a stop to the global expansion and to tell the brothers to stay home and focus on their own country, fearing that if the monarchy became too human, it would lose the mystery and the magic that had kept it alive for 1,000 years. The tension in the palace reached a breaking point when a massive, golden-sealed invitation arrived from the United Nations, asking Prince William and Prince Harry to speak to all the world leaders at a special summit about how to use the Diana Charter to change the way countries take care of their most vulnerable people. This was the biggest stage in the world, a moment that would either turn the brothers into global leaders of a new era or create a final, permanent split with the old guard of the palace. William and Harry stood in the hallway, looking at the invitation and then at the red-faced advisors who were blocking their path, and they realized that they were at the center of a storm that was much bigger than their own family. They knew that if they went to the summit, they would be stepping onto a path that they could never walk back from, and that the men in gray suits would do everything in their power to make them fail. But then Harry looked at a photo of a little girl in a war-torn country who was holding a hand-drawn picture of his mother, and he knew that they didn't really have a choice at all. They had to go where the need was greatest, just like Diana always did. King Charles watched his sons from the doorway, seeing the weight of the world on their shoulders and the fire of their mother in their eyes, and he felt a profound sense of destiny unfolding right in front of him. He knew that the advisors were right about the danger, but he also knew that his sons were right about the hope, and as he walked forward to stand between the brothers and the gray-suited men, the entire palace went silent with a heavy, expectant air. He took the golden invitation from William's hand and looked at it for a long time, his face a mask of deep thought as he realized that the Diana Revolution was the only thing that could truly save the monarchy for the next generation. He looked at the advisors and told them in a voice that was as steady as a mountain that the world was changing whether they liked it or not, and that he would rather have a monarchy that served the world than one that sat alone in a cold, golden room. With the king's final blessing, the brothers knew that they were about to take the Diana way to the global stage, and as they began to pack their bags for the journey of a lifetime, they felt a surge of incredible energy that made them feel like they were finally ready to lead the world into a new age of kindness. The giant jet moved through the night sky like a silver bird, carrying the two brothers across the wide, dark ocean toward the bright and busy lights of New York City, where the biggest meeting in the world was waiting for them at the United Nations. As the plane flew over the millions of twinkling lights of the city that never sleeps, Prince William and Prince Harry looked out the window and felt a deep, fluttering nervousness in their stomachs that was even stronger than the feeling they had before the balcony walk in London. They knew that the United Nations was not just a palace of stone and gold, but a palace of ideas and power where the leaders of every single country gathered to decide the future of the planet. And they were there to ask those leaders to stop thinking only about money and wars, and to start thinking about the heart. The air inside the plane was quiet and filled with the smell of old paper as they looked over their speeches one last time, realizing that their mother had stood on this same ground many years ago, trying to tell the world the same truth that they were now carrying in their hands. When the plane finally landed and the doors opened to the cold, salty air of the city, they were met by a line of black cars and serious men with earpieces. But the brothers didn't feel like celebrities. They felt like messengers for a woman who was no longer there to speak for herself. They traveled through the streets where the tall skyscrapers reached up into the clouds like giant fingers, and they saw that even here, thousands of miles away from the palace, people were standing on the sidewalks holding pictures of Princess Diana and waving flags of hope. The next morning, as they walked into the giant, glass-walled building of the United Nations, the silence inside was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against their ears, and they could see the hundreds of leaders from every corner of the earth sitting in their rows of seats, waiting to hear what the two princes had to say. It was a cold and intimidating place, full of people who were used to making deals and talking in complicated languages. But as William and Harry walked toward the high wooden podium, they felt a warm and familiar presence beside them, as if their mother was walking right there in the shadows, holding their hands and telling them to be brave. The men in gray suits from all over the world were watching with skeptical eyes, their arms crossed as they prepared to hear what they thought would be just another boring royal speech. But they did not know that the brothers were about to set the room on fire with the truth. William reached the microphone first, the gold-leafed emblem of the UN behind him. And as he looked out at the sea of kings, presidents, and prime ministers, he didn't see powerful rulers. He saw people who had once been children and who had once known the love of a mother. Just as he prepared to speak the first words of the Diana Charter to the world, a sudden and unexpected flicker in the lights made everyone in the room gasp, and a group of powerful men in the back row began to whisper and point, their faces full of a secret anger that suggested they were not going to let the brothers change the world without a fight. William took a deep breath, his voice steady and low as it echoed through the massive hall, and he began to tell the story of a mother's love that was now becoming a global revolution, while the whole world watched through their television screens, holding their breath to see if the two brothers could truly turn the heart of the world toward the light. He spoke about the hidden sanctuary in the forest, the landmines in Angola, and the millions of people who were crying out for a leader who actually cared about their pain. And as he talked, the coldness of the room began to melt away like ice in the sun. Harry stood right beside him, his eyes scanning the crowd and finding the faces of the people who were starting to cry, and he realized that the Diana Way was not just a British dream, but it was a language that everyone in the world understood. The power of their unity was so strong that even the most stubborn leaders began to uncross their arms and lean forward, drawn in by the honesty of two brothers who were willing to be vulnerable in front of the entire planet. As the speech reached its climax, the atmosphere in the glass tower changed from one of politics to one of pure, raw emotion, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world was standing still, listening to the echoes of a princess who had finally found her voice through the sons she had left behind. As William spoke the final, beautiful words of his speech, telling the world leaders that the greatest power on earth is not the size of an army or the thickness of a bank account, but the depth of a human heart, he stepped back from the microphone and let a deep, heavy silence fill the massive glass hall. For several long seconds, no one in the room moved or even seemed to breathe, as if the spirit of Princess Diana had wrapped a soft, invisible blanket around the entire building, making these powerful men and women feel like they were sitting in a quiet church instead of a busy meeting. Harry stood right next to his brother, his hand resting on the wooden podium, and he could see tears glistening in the eyes of many leaders who had spent their whole lives being told that they had to be cold and tough to survive in the world of politics. The cameras were still rolling, sending the image of the two united brothers to billions of people across the globe, and it felt like the most peaceful and hopeful moment in human history, as if a giant war of the heart had finally been won by two sons who refused to give up on their mother's dream. However, just as the first person was about to clap their hands and start a celebration, a loud and sudden scraping sound of a chair moving across the hard floor broke the silence like a sharp crack of thunder in a clear blue sky. From the very middle of the room, A tall, elderly leader with a face as hard as a mountain and eyes as cold as a winter morning stood up slowly, his dark suit looking perfectly stiff and his expression full of a secret, angry energy that made everyone else turn their heads in a state of shock. This was a man who led one of the most powerful countries on the planet, a man who believed only in big banks, strong borders, and the rule of fear. And he looked at the two brothers with a sneer that showed he thought their talk of kindness was nothing more than a childish fairy tale. He didn't wait for permission to speak, but instead, his voice boomed through the hall, sounding like heavy stones falling into a deep well as he asked the princes how they expected the world to stay safe if everyone was busy being nice to each other. He argued that the Diana Charter would make nations weak, and that the money being spent on sanctuaries should be used for better weapons and bigger walls to keep people out of their kingdoms. The room suddenly turned very cold again, the warmth of the speech vanishing like a candle being blown out by a mean wind, and the men in gray suits who had followed them from London started to nod their heads in the back of the room, their faces full of a dark hope that the old ways might still win the day. William and Harry felt a sharp pang of worry in their chests, realizing that the biggest challenge of their lives was happening right now, in front of the whole world, and that if they didn't have a good answer, their mother's legacy might be crushed forever. The cameras zoomed in on their faces, showing the sweat on their foreheads and the way they gripped the edges of the podium, but they did not look away from the mean man who was trying to humiliate them in public. The other leaders in the room looked back and forth between the cold man and the two young princes, their faces full of deep confusion and fear as they waited to see if the Diana way was strong enough to stand up to the way of the sword. It was a moment of incredible suspense, where the future of the entire human family seemed to be hanging by a single, thin thread, and the silence that followed the man's question was even scarier than the shouting that had come before it. Harry leaned in toward William, whispering something that no one else could hear, and as his brother's face changed from one of worry to one of fierce, brave light, the world knew that the battle for the soul of the monarchy and the planet was only just beginning. The cold leader sat down back in his chair, looking like he had already won the fight and made the princes look small, but Prince William didn't look down at his notes or look for a way to run away from the hard questions that had been thrown at him. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath that seemed to fill his whole body with a quiet and steady power, and he stepped back up to the microphone with a look in his eyes that was so honest and so brave that it made the people in the very back of the room lean forward just to see him better. He didn't use big, angry words to yell back at the man, and he didn't try to act like he was better than anyone else, but instead, he spoke in a soft and gentle voice that sounded like a father talking to a child who is afraid of the dark, telling the massive hall that true strength is not about who has the biggest gun or the thickest wall, but about who is brave enough to hold a hand in the middle of a storm. He told a story that no one had heard before, about a tough soldier he had met in the dusty fields of Angola, a man who was covered in scars and had seen the worst things a person can ever see during a war, and how that same strong soldier had broken down and cried with pure joy when he saw a playground being built where a dangerous minefield used to be. William looked directly into the eyes of the cold leader and told him that even the strongest walls in the world cannot protect a heart that is filled with fear, and that a nation is only truly safe when its people feel loved and cared for by those who sit on the thrones and in the high offices of power. As William spoke these words, the cameras from every news station on the planet captured the exact moment when the hard, frozen face of the elderly leader began to change, his eyes softening and his jaw relaxing as a long-forgotten memory of his own mother seemed to flicker in his mind like a tiny candle in a dark room. The entire room became so quiet that you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioners and the distant sound of the city outside, and the men in gray suits, who had been smirking in the back now, looked confused and worried because they could feel the power of their old, cold world slipping away right in front of their eyes. William finished his answer by saying that his mother, Diana, didn't want the world to be weak or soft, but she wanted the world to be brave enough to be kind, and that her heart was not a silly fairy tale, but a real blueprint for a future where no child has to grow up in the shadow of a wall or the fear of a bomb. When he finally stopped talking and stepped away from the podium, the cold leader didn't stay in his seat or try to argue anymore, but he slowly stood up again, and for a second, everyone in the hall thought he was going to start shouting, but instead, he began to clap his hands with a slow and rhythmic sound that was soon joined by every single person in the massive glass tower. It was a sound like a giant wave crashing on the shore, a roar of approval that told the whole planet that the Diana Revolution was not just a dream anymore, but was the new way of the world for every country on Earth. The world was watching with tears of joy as the cold leader walked all the way down the long aisle to the front of the room and reached out his hand to both William and Harry, a silent and powerful sign that he was ready to change his mind and join their mission of the heart. This was the shock that no one had ever expected to see, the moment when the hardest heart in the room was moved by the simple truth of a mother's love. And the news reports across the globe began to tell the story of how the princes had done the impossible and brought peace to a room full of warriors. Even the palace advisors back in London were frozen in front of their television screens, realizing that their power to control the royal family was gone forever, and that the world had finally chosen to follow the light instead of the shadows. William and Harry felt a surge of incredible relief and happiness, knowing that their mother's legacy was now protected by the entire human family. And as they stood there shaking the hands of presidents and kings, they felt like they were finally standing in the warm light of a brand new day. But as the celebration filled the hall and the people outside began to dance in the streets, a secret messenger was already moving through the crowd with a dark and mysterious envelope that was meant only for Harry, a message that would lead the brothers into one last, hidden secret that their mother had kept tucked away from everyone for 27 years. The celebration inside the great glass tower was still roaring like a giant, happy storm, with world leaders laughing and shaking hands as they realized a new age of kindness had truly begun. But Prince Harry felt a sudden and strange tug on his sleeve that pulled his mind away from the bright lights. As he turned around, he saw a man dressed in a long, dark coat that looked like it belonged to another century, his face hidden in the shadows of a large hat, and his eyes filled with a deep, quiet secret that made the air around him feel cold and still. The man didn't say a single word, but he quickly pressed a heavy, dark envelope into Harry's hand and disappeared into the crowd of shouting reporters so fast that it was as if he had turned into smoke and drifted away through the cracks in the walls. Harry felt a sharp jolt of electricity run through his fingers as he gripped the thick, rough paper, and he immediately grabbed William's arm, pulling his brother away from the cameras, and into a small, empty room where the only sound was the distant hum of the city and the beating of their own hearts. With hands that were trembling with a mixture of fear and incredible excitement, Harry tore open the envelope and found a single, faded photograph of a tiny, lonely lighthouse sitting on a jagged rock in the middle of a wild and foaming ocean. Tucked behind the photo was a final, secret note from their mother, written in a hurried and messy script that looked like it had been penned in the middle of a great storm just days before the world lost her forever. The note spoke of a place called the Blue Sanctuary, a hidden island that wasn't on any official royal map, where Diana had gone to find peace and to hide a final gift for her sons that she hoped would one day lead them to the truth about who they were meant to be. The brothers looked at the tiny, hand-drawn map that was included in the envelope, seeing a small dot far out in the cold waters of the North Sea, and they realized that this was the very last piece of the puzzle that their mother had kept tucked away from the men in gray suits for 27 years. They felt a profound sense of destiny as they stood in that quiet room, realizing that their journey was leading them away from the bright lights of the United Nations and toward the darkest, loneliest parts of the world to find the final secret of their mother's heart. William looked at the photograph and then at his brother, and he knew that they couldn't wait for permission or for the advisors to tell them it was safe, because this was a mission of the soul that belonged only to the two of them. They realized that their mother had been preparing them for this moment since they were children, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs through history that only they could follow, and they felt a surge of incredible strength that made the big glass tower feel small and unimportant compared to the secret of the island. Without saying a word to the king or the guards, they slipped out of a back door and into the cool night air of New York City, ready to cross the ocean one last time to find the place where their mother had said her final, secret goodbye to the world. The bright and glittering lights of New York City were soon nothing more than a tiny, glowing memory, as Prince William and Prince Harry found themselves huddled together on the deck of a small, sturdy fishing boat that was cutting through the freezing, ink-black waters of the North Sea. They had left the fancy world of the United Nations behind in the middle of the night, choosing to travel in secret because they knew that the men in gray suits would never allow the future king and his brother to risk their lives on such a dangerous journey through a brewing storm. The wind was no longer just a breeze. but it had turned into a wild, screaming monster that whipped the salty sea spray into their faces and made the boat toss and turn like a tiny wooden toy in a giant's bathtub. Every time a massive, mountain-sized wave crashed against the side of the boat, sending a freezing wall of water over the deck, the brothers gripped the iron railings and each other's arms so tightly that their hands went numb, but they refused to go below the deck to hide. They kept their eyes fixed on the dark horizon, searching through the driving rain and the thick, heavy mist for any sign of the jagged rock and the lonely lighthouse that had been pictured in their mother's final photograph. The air was filled with the deafening roar of the ocean and the groaning of the boat's wooden boards, a sound so powerful that they had to shout just to hear each other. Yet in their hearts, they felt a strange and quiet peace that told them they were exactly where they were supposed to be. As the storm reached its peak, and the lightning began to split the sky into jagged pieces of electric blue, a tiny, flickering light finally appeared in the distance, looking like a single brave star that refused to be put out by the darkness. It was the lighthouse of the Blue Sanctuary, standing tall and proud on a sharp cliff of black rock that looked like the teeth of a giant beast rising out of the foaming white waves. The captain of the boat, a man with a face as wrinkled and tough as old leather, shouted that it was too dangerous to get any closer. But William and Harry looked at the light and then at each other, and they knew that they couldn't turn back now after coming so far across the world. They climbed into a smaller rubber boat and began the terrifying journey toward the shore, their oars fighting against the pulling tide and the crashing surf that threatened to flip them over into the deep, cold water at any second. With one final, desperate push that required every bit of strength in their bodies, the boat hit the slick, wet stones of the island, and the brothers jumped out into the knee-deep water, pulling their small craft onto the land as the storm raged on around them. They stood on the edge of the jagged rock, their clothes soaked through and their bodies shivering with the cold. But as they looked up at the massive stone tower of the lighthouse, they felt a surge of incredible warmth and hope. The walk up the steep, winding path to the lighthouse door was a struggle against the wind that tried to blow them off the cliff. But the brothers leaned into each other and moved forward one slow step at a time, their eyes never leaving the bright beam of light that was sweeping across the dark sea. When they finally reached the heavy, rusted iron door at the base of the tower, they found that it was not locked, but it swung open with a long, slow creak that sounded like a sigh of relief from the past. Inside, the air was suddenly still and quiet, smelling of old salt, dry wood, and the faint, sweet scent of the lilies that seemed to follow their mother wherever she went. A single candle was burning on a small wooden table in the center of the room, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls, and next to the candle sat a small, leather-bound book that looked like it had been waiting for them to find it for 27 long years. William and Harry walked toward the table, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space, and they realized that they were standing in the very last place their mother had ever felt truly safe and happy. They reached out together to open the first page of the book, their hearts thumping with a mixture of fear and wonder, knowing that the final secret of the Blue Sanctuary was about to change their lives and the history of the world forever. With hands that were still cold and shaking from the freezing spray of the North Sea, Prince William and Prince Harry reached out together and touched the worn, brown leather of the mysterious book, feeling a strange and powerful warmth that seemed to travel from the cover right into their tired souls. As they slowly turned the first delicate page, which was as thin and yellowed as an old leaf, they saw their mother's familiar and beautiful handwriting, but it wasn't the neat and careful script she used for her official royal letters. Instead, it was a fast and passionate writing that looked like she was trying to get every single dream out of her head before the sun went down. The book was a secret journal, a journal of dreams, that Diana had kept hidden on this lonely rock in the ocean. And as the brothers began to read the words by the soft, flickering light of the single candle, they felt as though they were hearing her voice whispering directly into their ears across the bridge of time. She wrote about a treasure that she had spent her life trying to build, but it wasn't a treasure made of gold bars, sparkling diamonds, or heavy crowns that lived in a cold bank vault. It was a treasure of the human spirit that she wanted to give to every person on the planet who felt forgotten or unloved. Tucked deep between the middle pages of the book, they found a massive, hand-drawn map that was unlike any map they had ever seen in a geography book or on a computer screen, because it didn't show the borders of countries or the names of big cities. Instead, the map was covered in thousands of tiny, glowing red dots that marked the locations of every single secret project, every small hospital, and every tiny schoolhouse that Diana had been secretly funding with her own personal money for years, creating a secret global village of peace that stretched across every continent from the coldest mountains to the hottest deserts. The brothers looked at the map in total wonder, realizing that their mother had been a secret architect of a much better world. A world where kindness was the only law and where no child was ever left behind. And they saw that she had left the final, most important piece of the map empty, waiting for them to fill it in with their own bravery. She wrote in the final pages that the true crown is not something you wear on your head to make yourself look important, but it is something you build with your hands to make others feel safe. And she challenged her sons to find the secret vault she had hidden beneath the floorboards of the lighthouse itself. William and Harry dropped to their knees on the cold stone floor, their eyes searching through the shadows and the dust until they found a small, iron ring hidden in a corner behind a stack of old wood. With a loud and heavy groan of metal against stone, they pulled back a secret trapdoor and saw a small wooden chest that was filled to the brim with thousands of packets of rare and beautiful seeds from every country on Earth, along with the blueprints for a global garden of peace that would provide food and beauty to anyone who was hungry or sad. This was the treasure Diana had left for the people of the world, the power to grow their own hope and to build a future where the Earth itself was a sanctuary for everyone. The brothers realized that the men in gray suits would have never understood a treasure made of seeds and dreams, because they only cared about things they could count and lock away. But to William and Harry, these tiny seeds were more valuable than all the gold in the royal mint. They sat on the floor of the quiet lighthouse for hours, the storm still howling outside but their hearts feeling as warm as a summer day, as they realized that they were now the guardians of the most important secret in the history of the monarchy. They felt a profound sense of duty and love, knowing that they had to take this map and these seeds back to the world and start the final and greatest chapter of the Diana Revolution that would turn the entire planet into a garden of healing and light. As the candle began to burn low and the first light of a new morning started to touch the windows of the lighthouse, the brothers stood up with the journal and the chest of seeds clutched tightly to their chests, ready to leave the blue sanctuary and face the world one last time, no longer as just princes of a small island, but as the champions of a global dream that was finally, after 27 years, ready to bloom. The morning air in London was cold and felt like sharp needles against the skin as Prince William and Prince Harry finally returned from the wild, crashing waves of the North Sea, their faces tired but their spirits shining with a secret light that no storm could ever wash away. They carried the small wooden chest of seeds and the hidden journal of dreams like they were holding the very soul of the world. But as their car pulled up to the grand, golden gates of the palace, they realized that the men in gray suits had not been sleeping while the brothers were away on their secret mission. The palace was not filled with the happy sounds of the people or the warm light of the Diana Charter anymore, but instead, it felt like a cold, stone trap that was closing its iron jaws around them to protect the old, dusty secrets of the past. The advisors had spent the last 48 hours in a state of total panic, and they had decided to use their final and most terrifying weapon to stop the brothers forever. They had called for an emergency meeting of the world's most powerful bankers, the kings of gold, who controlled all the money and all the banks across the entire planet. These men were even colder and scarier than the palace advisors, because they only cared about numbers and power, and they believed that Diana's dream of a global village of peace would destroy the way the world worked and make them lose their control over the people. When William and Harry walked into the massive, dark-paneled room where the meeting was being held, the air was so heavy and still that it felt like they were stepping into a giant freezer, and the rows of men in their black suits looked like a wall of shadows that no amount of kindness could ever break through. The head advisor stood at the front of the room, his voice sounding like dry bones rattling in the wind, as he told the bankers that the two princes were planning to use the royal fortune to give everything away to the poor, which would make the banks collapse and bring chaos to every country on Earth. He pointed a shaking finger at the wooden chest in William's arms and laughed a mean, cold laugh, saying that a handful of seeds and a mother's diary were a threat to the safety of the entire human family. The bankers sat in a long, silent line, their eyes as hard as diamonds as they looked at the two brothers, and the leader of the Money Kings, a man who hadn't smiled in 50 years, leaned forward and said that they were prepared to freeze every single penny of the royal family's money if the brothers did not hand over the map and the journal immediately. It was a moment of incredible suspense and fear, where the brothers felt like they were standing on the edge of a high cliff with the whole world waiting to see if they would fall or fly. William gripped the chest tighter, feeling the tiny seeds inside shifting like a living heart, and he realized that the men in gray suits had finally brought the battle to the one place where they thought the heart could never win the world of cold, hard gold. Harry looked at the bankers and then at his brother, his jaw set in a look of fierce courage that showed he would rather be poor and honest than rich and silent, and he prepared to tell the Money Kings exactly what his mother had written in the secret journal. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls of the palace closing in as the two worlds crashed together in a final, desperate struggle for the future of the monarchy and the planet. The bankers were reaching for their pens to sign the orders that would stop the Diana Revolution forever, and for a second, it looked like the light of the lighthouse was finally going to be put out by the shadows of the bank vaults. The cold, heavy air in the dark-paneled room felt like it was pressing against Prince William's chest as he stood before the row of powerful bankers, but he did not let his shoulders slump or his eyes look down at the floor in fear. He took a long, steady breath, the kind of breath his mother used to take before she walked into a room full of people who didn't want her there, and he began to speak in a voice that was so calm and so clear that it seemed to slice right through the icy silence of the kings of gold. He told them that he understood they were afraid of losing their power and their piles of shiny coins, but he asked them to look past the numbers on their glowing computer screens and to think about the real world that was waiting just outside the heavy palace doors. He spoke about the Journal of Dreams and the chest of seeds he was holding, explaining that these were not things that would destroy the world, but were the only things that could truly save it from becoming a cold and lonely desert where no one cared about their neighbor. William told a story about a small village he had seen where the banks were full of money, but the children were hungry and the hospitals were empty, and he asked the bankers if they really wanted to be remembered as the men who chose gold over life. As he talked, the men in gray suits tried to interrupt him with loud coughs and angry whispers, but the power of his words was like a warm sun melting a thick block of ice, and even the sternest bankers began to look at each other with a strange and flickering doubt in their eyes. Harry stood right beside his brother, his hand resting on the wooden chest like a shield, and he added that the Diana Revolution was not about making anyone poor, but about making everyone rich in the things that actually matter, like kindness, safety, and a future where every child has a bed to sleep in. He challenged the bankers to imagine a world where their own children didn't have to live in fear of wars or hunger, and he told them that the royal money was finally being used to build a foundation that would last 1,000 years because it was built on the truth. The room remained very quiet for a long time after the brothers finished speaking, the only sound being the ticking of the old clock and the heavy breathing of the nervous advisors, until finally, the leader of the Money Kings reached for his golden pen to sign the order to freeze the accounts. But just as the tip of the pen touched the paper, a quiet and shaky voice came from a dark corner of the room where the oldest and most mysterious banker had been sitting in total silence for the entire meeting. This was a man who was so old he remembered the days before computers, a man who had seen many kings and queens come and go, and he slowly stood up with a look of incredible peace on his face that made everyone else stop and stare in total shock. He walked slowly toward the front of the room, his cane clicking on the floor with a rhythmic sound, and he told the other bankers that he had known Princess Diana when she was just a young girl, and that he had promised her a long time ago that he would watch over her sons when the world became too cold for them. He revealed that he was a secret ally who had been helping Diana hide her projects for years, and he told the room that if they tried to freeze the royal money, he would use his own massive fortune to make sure the Diana Charter continued even stronger than before. The men in gray suits looked like they were going to faint with anger and surprise, as they realized that the biggest and most powerful banker of them all was actually on the side of the heart. The old man looked at William and Harry with a twinkle in his eye and a soft smile, telling them that their mother would be so proud of the men they had become, and that the Money Kings were no match for the power of a family that is finally united in the truth. This was the turning point that changed everything, the moment when the shadows of the boardroom were finally chased away by a light from the past, and the other bankers began to lower their pens as they realized that the Diana Revolution was now unstoppable. The head advisor tried to shout that this was against the rules, but King Charles walked into the room at that exact moment and told him that the only rule that mattered now was the rule of love, and that the meeting was officially over. The brothers felt a surge of incredible relief and victory, knowing that they had faced the scariest men in the world and had come out on top because they were brave enough to speak from their hearts. They realized that their mother had friends in places they never even dreamed of, people who had been waiting for 27 years for the right moment to help her sons finish her work. As the bankers began to leave the room, some of them even stopping to shake the brothers' hands and offer their help, William and Harry knew that the final wall between them and their mother's dream had finally crumbled into dust. They walked out of the dark boardroom and into the bright, sunny hallway of the palace, feeling like they were finally free to take the chest of seeds and the journal of dreams to the rest of the world to start the greatest planting in history. With the chest of secret seeds held firmly between them and the old banker's blessing still ringing in their ears, Prince William and Prince Harry did not waste a single moment resting inside the palace walls, for they knew that the world was finally ready for the beauty their mother had hidden away so long ago. They boarded the royal plane, which was no longer a symbol of cold power, but was now filled with bags of soil, watering cans, and teams of young gardeners who were eager to help turn the entire planet into a sanctuary of peace. Their journey took them across the vast blue oceans and over the tallest, snow-capped mountains, stopping in every country where the Diana Charter had already started to heal the hearts of the people. In the dusty fields of Angola, they returned to the very spot where the landmines had once been, and they knelt together in the red earth to plant the first golden seeds from the chest, watching as the local children cheered and sang songs of thanks under the hot African sun. From there, they traveled to the busy, crowded streets of Mumbai, the lush rainforests of Brazil, and the quiet, tiny villages of the snowy north. And in every place they visited, they planted a Diana garden that would serve as a living, breathing place where anyone who was hungry, lonely, or afraid could find a bit of magic and a lot of love. The seeds from the lighthouse were truly special, for they grew into flowers and trees that were more beautiful and strong than anything anyone had ever seen, filling the air with a scent that reminded everyone of the Queen of Hearts and her endless kindness. As the months went by and the gardens began to bloom all over the earth, the world began to change in a way that made the old news reports about wars and money feel like a bad dream from a long time ago. People in different countries started to talk to each other like neighbors instead of enemies, and the Diana way became a language that everyone understood, a language of helping others and telling the truth even when it was hard. Back in London, the palace had changed too, as the dark and scary shadows were replaced by bright windows and hallways filled with the sound of music and the laughter of the public who were now invited inside every single day. King Charles and Queen Camilla were no longer worried about the men in gray suits, because those advisors had either joined the new mission or had left to find jobs where people didn't care about the heart. Charles felt a profound sense of peace as he watched his sons return from their global mission, seeing that they had not only saved the monarchy, but had saved the soul of the entire family by being brave enough to follow their mother's light. The final day of the Diana Revolution arrived with a morning that was so bright and clear it felt like the sky itself was celebrating, and the royal family prepared for a massive festival at the palace that would be the biggest and most beautiful party the world had ever seen. Thousands of people from every country where a garden had been planted traveled to London, bringing with them flowers and stories of how their lives had been changed by the brothers' mission. And the streets were filled with a sea of color and joy that made the gray stones of the city look like they were glowing. William and Harry stood on the grand balcony one last time, but this time they were not alone. They were joined by King Charles, Queen Camilla, and even the young children from the hidden forest sanctuary, all standing together as a real united family. As the sun reached the middle of the sky, a soft and gentle breeze blew through the city, carrying the scent of millions of lilies and roses, and for a moment, everyone in the crowd went silent as a giant, shimmering rainbow appeared in the clear blue sky, even though there wasn't a single drop of rain. It was the final, most beautiful sign that Princess Diana was finally at peace, and that her sons had fulfilled every dream she had ever kept in her secret journal. The brothers looked at each other and then at the cheering world below, and they realized that they were no longer just princes of a small island, but they were the guardians of a global heart that would never be cold or silent again. The story that had started with a bold move and a shaken queen had ended with a world that was finally healed and a family that was finally whole, proving that the power of a mother's love is the greatest force in the universe. As the music played and the people danced in the gardens of the palace, William and Harry knew that their journey would never truly end, because every new flower that bloomed and every child that smiled was a part of the legacy they would protect forever. They had turned the crown into a symbol of kindness and the palace into a home for everyone. And as they walked back inside to join their family for the final celebration, they felt a sense of pride that was deeper than any ocean and stronger than any throne. The Diana Revolution was complete, and as the stars began to twinkle over the transformed city of London, the world knew that the light of the princess would shine on through her sons for 1,000 years to come, making every day a little bit brighter, and every heart a little bit braver. His sun finally began to dip below the horizon of a world that had been transformed by the courage of two brothers and the enduring love of a mother who refused to be forgotten, casting a long, golden glow over the quiet gardens of the palace, where the air was now filled with the sweet scent of lilies and the soft sound of evening birds. Prince William and Prince Harry stood together on the stone path, their shadows stretching long behind them like giants from an old story, and they looked at the massive palace that no longer felt like a cold, gray fortress of secrets, but like a warm and open home for the entire human family. They realized that their long journey, from the dark, rainy night of the first announcement to the dusty fields of Angola and the lonely lighthouse in the middle of the sea, had finally reached its beautiful and perfect end. The Diana Revolution was no longer a fight or a struggle, but it had become a natural part of the world's heartbeat, a permanent change that ensured the monarchy would forever lead with kindness instead of cold rules. As the first stars of the night began to twinkle in the deep purple sky, the brothers felt a profound sense of peace and satisfaction, knowing that they had not only saved their family's future, but had also given their mother the greatest gift a son can ever give, the gift of the truth. They turned to look at each other one last time, sharing a silent and powerful nod of brotherhood that said they would always be there to protect each other and the legacy they had rebuilt with their own hands. The story of the two princes and the Queen of Hearts was no longer a tragedy to be whispered in the shadows, but it was a bright and shining legend that would be told to children for 1,000 years, proving to everyone that no matter how dark the world becomes, a single act of honest love can turn the shadows back into light. As they walked back toward the palace doors, their hearts full of hope and their spirits free from the ghosts of the past, the world knew that the light of Princess Diana would never go out again, for it was burning brightly in the eyes of her sons and in every garden of peace they had planted across the earth. This was the moment where the past finally met the future and shook hands, leaving a legacy of healing that would nourish the world forever. And as the heavy doors closed softly behind them, the only thing left in the air was the beautiful, lingering memory of a mother's final smile.